Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. England on the eve of conquest. You wake early in England in the year 1066 because most people do. There is little reason to sleep once the light arrives, and in winter the cold nudges you awake anyway. The houses around you are made of timber and wattle, patched with mud, roofs thick with thatch. Smoke curls lazily from holes in the roof, carrying the smell of damp wood and yesterday's fire. This is a quiet kingdom, mostly agricultural, mostly routine, and largely unaware that it stands on the edge of a permanent transformation. England at this moment is not chaotic. That is important to understand. It is governed, taxed, counted, prayed over, and worked with a steady rhythm. Kings have ruled here for centuries, interrupted by invasions, yes, but also by long stretches of stability. The laws are written down. The shires are organized. Sheriffs collect royal revenues. Courts meet. Disputes are heard. Land boundaries are remembered by old men who walk them each year with younger ones, pointing out stones and trees and bends in streams. You live in a world where memory matters. Very little is written compared to later centuries, so people remember things carefully. Who owns which strip of land? Who owes labor to whom? Who wronged whose father 20 years ago? These remembered obligations shape daily life far more than royal proclamations ever will. At the top of this world sits King Edward, known later as the Confessor. In 1066, he is an old man by medieval standards, thin, pious, and quiet. He spends long hours in prayer. He avoids bloodshed when he can. He has ruled England for over 20 years, and under him the kingdom has been mostly peaceful. That peace, however, has been purchased by compromise. Edward has no children. This fact alone creates a low, constant tension in the kingdom, like a draft you feel but cannot see. Everyone knows it. Everyone talks about it carefully. Succession is not a neat legal process yet. It is a mixture of bloodline, approval by powerful nobles, and acceptance by the church. A king without an heir is not just a personal tragedy, it is a political problem that seeps into every corner of governance. Around Edward stands the English nobility, especially the great earls. Among them, none is more powerful than Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. His family controls vast lands across southern England. His brothers command regions and fleets. His sister is married to the king. Harold is competent, experienced, and deeply English in his outlook. He knows the land, the people, the weather, and the roads. He has led armies before. He has crushed rebellions. He has negotiated with foreign powers. You might assume this makes England strong, and in many ways it does. But it also means that power is concentrated in a few hands, and where power concentrates, rivalries quietly grow. Daily life continues regardless. If you are a peasant, you measure your year by the agricultural calendar. Plowing in spring, haymaking in summer, harvest in autumn, survival in winter. You owe labor to your lord, days spent working his fields instead of your own. You pay rent in produce more often than coin. You attend church not only for faith, but because it is where news travels. Priests speak Latin at the altar but English outside it. Saints' days provide rare breaks from labor. If you are a craftsman in a town, your life is busier and louder. Markets hum with barter. Iron tools, wool, salted fish, leather goods all pass from hand to hand. England's wool is already valuable, even if few people yet think of it as an export powerhouse. Coinage exists and is sophisticated. English pennies are widely trusted for their silver content. This quiet financial reliability is one of the kingdom's understated strengths. The church is everywhere. Monasteries dot the landscape, not only as spiritual centers but as economic ones. Monks drain marshes, manage estates, copy texts. Some monasteries are wealthy, others poor, but all are woven into the fabric of governance. Bishops sit beside earls in councils. God and king are not separate spheres, they reinforce each other. And yet beyond England's shores, others are paying close attention. Across the Channel lies Normandy, a land shaped by descendants of Viking settlers who have become thoroughly Frankish in language and culture, but not in temperament. Normandy is more militarized than England. Its nobles are used to castle warfare, to private violence, to rapid mobilization. Their Duke, William, watches England with intense interest. To the north, across the North Sea, Scandinavian kings still see England as familiar territory. Their ancestors ruled here within living memory, at least by medieval standards. Songs and sagas recall English silver and fertile land. For them, England is not foreign, it is unfinished business. England itself has grown comfortable. Its defenses rely heavily on the fiat, a militia system where free men are called up temporarily in times of need. They are farmers first, soldiers second. This works well for short campaigns and local threats, but it strains under prolonged pressure. Ships must be maintained. Men must be fed. Fields cannot be left unattended forever. You can feel none of this directly as you go about your day. You repair a fence. You shear sheep. You listen to gossip about the king's health. You hear rumors of oaths sworn long ago, of promises made and disputed. But these things feel distant, abstract. The roads are still walked, the bells still ring, the laws still hold. And yet, everything depends on one fragile question that no one can yet answer with certainty. When King Edward dies, who will England accept as king, and who will refuse to accept that choice? As the year 1066 unfolds, nothing outwardly dramatic happens at first. Seasons turn as they always have. Lambs are born, fields are plowed, courts meet. But beneath this steady surface, England's political world is tightening, drawing inward around the figure of the aging king and the unspoken question of succession. King Edward grows weaker. He does not announce it, but everyone close to him can see it. His movements are slower. His fasting is longer. His moments of exhaustion more frequent. Courtiers begin to linger a little longer in Westminster, not wanting to be far away when the moment comes. Messengers travel more often between great households. Words are chosen more carefully. Edward's kingship has always been unusual. Raised in exile in Normandy, he returned to England only after decades away, and he never entirely severed his Norman connections. His court includes Norman clerics and advisors, men who speak French-accented Latin and bring continental ideas about church reform and authority. To some English nobles, this is mildly irritating. To others, it is alarming. Yet Edward also depends heavily on English power brokers, especially the Godwin family. Earl Godwin himself had once dominated the kingdom, only to fall from favor and then return. After his death, his son Harold inherited not just lands but influence, experience, and expectations. Harold is the kind of man people imagine as king even before the crown is discussed openly. He is visible. He leads men in battle. He presides over courts. He settles disputes. He travels constantly, reinforcing loyalty through presence. Power in England is personal in this way. Documents matter, but relationships matter more. When Harold arrives in a shire, he eats at the tables of local thanes. He listens to complaints. He confirms land grants. These acts seem small, but they build something durable: acceptance. The Wittenagemot, the council of leading nobles and churchmen, exists as the body that advises the king and, crucially, confirms succession. It is not a parliament in the later sense. It meets irregularly. Its membership shifts, but it represents a collective sense of legitimacy. A king chosen without its support will struggle. This is why rumors of past promises are so dangerous. There are whispers that Edward once promised the throne to William of Normandy. The details are hazy, and no one can quite agree when or how such a promise was made. Was it during Edward's exile? During a later diplomatic exchange? Was it conditional? Spoken in private or witnessed? Medieval politics is full of such ambiguities, and each ambiguity becomes a weapon. Harold himself may have traveled to Normandy years earlier. Norman sources later claim he swore an oath supporting William's claim, possibly under duress. English sources are quieter on the matter. If the oath happened, It was not widely known in England at the time. Oaths, however, are sacred things in this world. To swear falsely is to endanger your soul. To break an oath sworn on holy relics is worse. And yet, oaths made under pressure, or without the consent of the realm, occupy a gray space. What matters is not just what happened, but what people believe happened, and what they are willing to enforce. Meanwhile, England's administrative machinery keeps working. Taxes are assessed, coinage is minted, royal writs go out, short documents sealed with wax, commanding obedience in the king's name. Sheriffs are expected to deliver revenue reliably. This system is efficient by medieval standards, and it binds the kingdom together more tightly than many outsiders realize. The army, too, is quietly prepared. Harold oversees coastal defenses. The southern coast is watched carefully. Ships are gathered not for invasion but for deterrence. England has faced threats before, and its leaders know the danger of complacency. The field can be summoned quickly, but it cannot be kept in the field forever. Men must return to their farms or famine follows. This limitation shapes strategy. Any foreign invasion must be met quickly, decisively. Delay favors the attacker, who may be supported by professional soldiers and plunder. England's strength lies in rapid mobilization and local knowledge, not prolonged campaigning. Religion weaves through all of this. Edward's piety lends his reign moral weight. He is seen as a holy king, almost monk-like. Miracles are attributed to him even before his death. This sanctity makes opposition to his wishes uncomfortable, even risky. To argue against Edward is, in some sense, to argue against God's chosen ruler. And yet, sanctity does not solve succession. The church itself is divided. Some bishops are English-born, steeped in local custom. Others are reform-minded and internationally connected, more aligned with Rome and continental norms. They do not all agree on what makes a legitimate king or how much weight foreign claims should carry. Beyond the elite, ordinary people sense unease without fully understanding it. They hear more talk of musters and watch duty. They notice ships being repaired. They hear priests pray for the king's health more fervently. Anxiety does not yet dominate daily life, but it hums quietly in the background. Winter approaches, and with it, illness. King Edward takes to his bed. Westminster Abbey, newly rebuilt, stands as a symbol of his reign: stone instead of timber, permanence instead of decay. It is here that he spends his final days, surrounded by nobles who will soon have to decide England's future. When Edward finally dies, it happens quickly. One day he is there, the next he is gone. The transition from living king to remembered king is abrupt. There is no long interregnum. England does not pause. Decisions must be made immediately. The Witnagemote gathers. The question that has lingered for years now demands an answer. Who is best suited to rule? Who can defend the kingdom? Who will be accepted by the people and the church? Harold Godwinson is chosen. Crowned swiftly, almost urgently, he becomes King Harold II. The speed matters. It projects confidence. It closes the door to rival claims, at least in theory. Harold is crowned in Westminster Abbey, under the same roof Edward built, inheriting not just the throne but its unresolved tensions. But choices made quickly often leave loose ends. Across the sea, news travels fast. William of Normandy hears of Harold's coronation, and he does not accept it as legitimate. To him, an oath has been broken, an injustice committed. In the north, Harold Hardrada hears too and sees opportunity. To him, England is open, contested, vulnerable. Harold now wears the crown, but the crown does not bring rest. It brings weight, expectation, and enemies. England stands unified on the surface, but surrounded by men who believe the throne should be theirs instead. And as spring turns towards summer, the question shifts from who should rule England to something far more immediate and dangerous. Who will be willing to fight for that belief? The crown rests on Harold's head, but it does not sit lightly. In the weeks after his coronation, England does not erupt into chaos. nor does it settle into comfort. Instead, it enters a peculiar state of alert stillness. The machinery of governance continues to turn courts meet, rents are collected, prayers are said, but everything now feels provisional, as though the kingdom itself is holding its breath. Harold knows this. He has spent his life navigating power, and he understands that being crowned is not the same as being secure. Kingship, especially in England, is something that must be constantly reaffirmed through action. Presence matters. Authority must be seen, not just declared. So Harold moves. He travels through the kingdom in the early months of 1066, appearing at assemblies, confirming charters, rewarding loyalty. These acts are not ceremonial fluff, they are survival strategies. Each land grant reaffirmed, each dispute settled, binds another thread of obligation to the crown. The nobility watch him closely. So does the church. Harold's brothers play key roles. Tostig, once Earl of Northumbria, is no longer among them. He has been exiled after an unpopular rule and now simmers abroad, bitter and dangerous. Others, like Geath and Leofwine, support Harold and command regions and forces. Family loyalty is a strength, but it also creates vulnerabilities, especially when grievances fester. The coast becomes a focus. Ships are gathered again, this time not just as a precaution but as a necessity. Harold positions fleets along the southern shore, especially in Sussex and Kent, areas most vulnerable to a channel crossing. Men are called up for service. The Fiat assembles, waits, watches. This waiting is costly. Farmers pulled from their fields cannot plant or harvest properly. Supplies must be fed to men who are not producing anything while they wait. The longer the threat fails to materialize, the heavier the strain becomes. Harold understands this problem intimately. He cannot keep the kingdom mobilized indefinitely. The summer passes without invasion. Across the Channel, William of Normandy is also waiting, but his waiting looks different. He is not constrained by harvest cycles in the same way. His forces include professional soldiers, knights accustomed to campaigning, men whose livelihood is war. Still, even William is at the mercy of weather, logistics, and diplomacy. He needs ships. He needs horses. He needs legitimacy. William works tirelessly on the last point. He sends envoys to Rome. He presents his claim not just as a personal grievance but as a moral one. He argues that Harold broke a sacred oath, that England's throne has been taken unjustly, that his invasion would be righteous, corrective. When the papal banner is granted, at least according to Norman accounts, it becomes more than a symbol. It reframes the coming conflict. William is no longer merely a foreign duke seeking conquest. He is, in his own telling, an agent of divine justice. This matters deeply in an age where spiritual authority shapes political loyalty. Back in England, rumors of William's preparations circulate, but nothing concrete arrives. Weeks stretch on. The Fiat grows restless. Supplies thin. Eventually, Harold makes a difficult decision. He allows many of the men to return home. The ships are sent back to London. England cannot remain frozen in anticipation forever. This moment, so ordinary, so necessary, will later be judged harshly by history. But at the time, it is practical. A king who starves his own land in preparation for an invasion that may not come risks rebellion, famine, and loss of legitimacy. Harold chooses sustainability over constant readiness. Then the North ignites. News arrives that Harold Hardrada, king of Norway, has landed with a massive force, aided by none other than Tostig Godwinson. The betrayal cuts deeply. Tostig knows England's weaknesses. He knows its politics. He knows Harold. The invasion in the north is not a feint. It is decisive and brutal. Northern earls scramble to respond. A battle is fought at Fulford near York, and the English forces there are defeated. The city surrenders. England is now unmistakably under attack. Harold reacts with speed that will later astonish chroniclers. He gathers his household troops and whatever Fiat he can summon and marches north hard, fast, relentless. The roads of England, familiar and well-maintained, work in his favor. Villages watch the army pass, dust rising, boots pounding, banners moving steadily toward danger. The march is exhausting. Men blister, stumble, push on, but morale is high. This is a familiar enemy. Vikings are a known quantity. England has faced them before and survived. There is confidence here, even grim determination. At Stamford Bridge near York, the two armies meet. What follows is violent, sudden, and decisive. Harold's forces catch the Norwegians by surprise. The battle is fierce but short. Harold Hardrada is killed. Tostig dies beside him. The Norwegian army is shattered. Of the hundreds of ships that brought them, only a fraction are needed to carry survivors home. It is a complete victory. And yet victory brings no rest. Almost immediately, word arrives from the south. William has landed. The wind, which held the Norman fleet in port for weeks, has finally turned. Ships cross the channel in enormous numbers, landing at Pevensey. Horses disembark. Supplies are unloaded. A fortified position is established. England now faces a second invasion, this one far better prepared and ideologically charged. Harold is still in the north when he hears the news. What follows is one of the most consequential decisions of his life. He could wait, gather more forces, let the Fiat assemble again. He could attempt to starve William out or harass him, but delay carries risks. William is building castles. William is consolidating. William is claiming the land as his own. Harold chooses speed again. He turns his army south, marching back the way he came, exhaustion piling upon exhaustion. Some men fall behind. Others push on out of loyalty, fear, or duty. The kingdom's fate compresses into days. By the time Harold reaches the south, England's margin for error has vanished. What began the year as a quiet, orderly kingdom confident in its routines, secure in its systems, now stands at the brink of irreversible change. The crown Harold wears is no longer just a symbol of authority. It is a challenge thrown down before rival kings, foreign armies, and history itself. England is about to learn that stability, no matter how carefully maintained, can be undone with startling speed, and that the ordinary lives you wake to each morning can be reshaped forever by decisions made far beyond your village, your field, or your sight. The question that now hangs over the kingdom is no longer who has the right to rule, but whether England itself will remain recognizably English when the fighting finally ends. How does a single year, crowded with hurried marches and competing claims, manage to divide a nation's history into a clear before and after? And can the people living through it ever truly understand that moment while they are still inside it? Story 2. Harold Godwinson and the Weight of the Crown. Before Harold Godwinson becomes king, before the crown presses down on his brow and history fixes his name to a single catastrophic year, he is something far more ordinary and in many ways far more interesting. He is a son, a brother, a landholder, a negotiator, and a survivor in a political world that quietly removes the uncareful. To understand Harold as king, you have to spend time with him as a man shaped by England itself. He is born into power, but not unquestioned power. His father, Godwin, rises from relatively modest origins to become Earl of Wessex, the most powerful earl in the kingdom. This ascent is not smooth. It requires loyalty to kings, strategic marriages, and a careful balancing of force and restraint. From childhood, Harold watches how authority is built not only through violence, but through patience, reputation, and timing. The England Harold grows up in is not a place where kings rule alone. Royal authority depends on cooperation from earls, bishops, and local elites. Disobedience does not always come as rebellion. More often, it arrives as delay, ambiguity, or selective obedience. Harold learns early that survival means reading people as closely as landscapes. As a young man, Harold is trained in warfare, but not in the romantic sense that later centuries imagine. There are no shining tournaments or theatrical duels. Warfare is practical, exhausting, and often ugly. It involves marching, waiting, raiding, negotiating, and occasionally fighting. Most conflicts end not in glorious battles but in submissions, settlements, and hostages exchanged. Harold proves adept at this kind of warfare. He leads campaigns against Welsh rulers, pushing into difficult terrain where roads are scarce and supply lines fragile. These campaigns matter not just militarily but symbolically. The Welsh marches are a testing ground for leadership. Commanders who fail here lose credibility. Harold does not. He also shows something equally important: restraint. He does not annihilate defeated enemies when submission is possible. This earns him a reputation for firmness without cruelty, a valuable trait in a kingdom that prefers order to spectacle. As Earl of Wessex, Harold governs a vast and wealthy region. This is not abstract authority. It means overseeing estates, ensuring rents are collected, resolving disputes, maintaining defenses, and keeping roads and bridges usable. The unglamorous details of governance fill most of his days. These details are what make armies move and loyalty hold. Harold's power base is distinctly English. He speaks the language of the people. He knows local customs. He understands how shire courts function and how much pressure they can bear before resentment builds. This familiarity gives him an advantage over foreign claimants, even before crowns and banners enter the conversation. Yet Harold's rise is not without tension. His family dominates too much of England for comfort. Other nobles worry quietly about balance. The king himself, Edward, alternates between reliance on the Godwins and fear of their influence. This uneasy relationship teaches Harold caution. He learns when to step back, when to advance, and when to wait. One episode lingers in memory: the exile of the Godwin family years earlier, when Edward briefly pushed back against their power. Harold experiences what it means to lose everything without bloodshed, lands confiscated, titles stripped, loyalty suddenly expensive. And then, just as importantly, he experiences return. Restoration does not come through reckless force, but through negotiation and patience. This pattern shapes Harold deeply. He becomes a man who believes problems can often be managed rather than destroyed. When Edward grows older and weaker, Harold's role expands naturally. He is the king's right hand, whether officially acknowledged or not. He leads diplomatic missions. He hosts foreign envoys. He ensures the kingdom functions smoothly while Edward retreats further into piety. It is during one such mission, one still debated by historians, that Harold finds himself in Normandy. The circumstances are unclear, deliberately so in later accounts. Was he shipwrecked? Sent as an envoy? Acting independently? Each version serves a different political purpose. What matters is not the exact truth, but the outcome. Harold ends up in William of Normandy's custody, treated with honor but not freedom. He accompanies William on campaign. He is shown Norman power and organization, and at some point he swears an oath. What that oath promised, under what conditions, and with what understanding, remains disputed even in Harold's own lifetime. But oaths are serious things. They bind not just men, but reputations. Harold returns to England with knowledge he cannot fully share and obligations he cannot openly acknowledge. Back home, life continues. Harold resumes his duties. He fights. He governs. He attends court. If the oath weighs on him, he gives no public sign. England remains stable, Edward remains king, and there is no immediate reason to challenge the arrangement. Then Edward dies. Harold's accession to the throne is swift, almost seamless. The Witnagemot supports him. The church crowns him. The people accept him. From an internal perspective, it looks like continuity, not rupture. Harold is not a radical change. He is the logical extension of existing power. But kingship changes him immediately. No longer can he balance power from just one region. No longer can he act as mediator between king and nobles. He is now the focal point of all expectations and all blame. Every decision becomes amplified. Every compromise risks being read as weakness. The crown also exposes him to older, larger forces: foreign ambition, religious legitimacy, and historical grievance. William of Normandy does not see Harold as a capable administrator or respected earl. He sees him as a usurper. Harold Hardrada does not see him as Edward's successor. He sees England as a prize. Harold's skill set is broad, but his resources are finite. He inherits a kingdom that works well in peacetime and under limited threat. What he does not inherit is margin. England's system is efficient but brittle under sustained pressure. The fiat cannot remain mobilized forever. Loyalty depends on success. As king, Harold must choose which threats to prioritize, how long to wait, and when to strike. He must decide when patience becomes paralysis and when speed becomes recklessness. These decisions are not made in isolation. They are made amid harvest cycles, weather patterns, feast days, and exhaustion. They are made by a man who has spent his life managing risk, not gambling everything on a single throw. And yet, history rarely allows such men the luxury of gradual adjustment. As the summer of 1066 progresses, Harold stands at the center of England's defenses, aware that danger approaches from more than one direction, aware that time itself has become an enemy. He has been shaped by years of careful governance and strategic patience, but the year ahead will demand something far more brutal. Choices made too quickly, with too little information, and consequences that cannot be reversed. The question that now begins to form, quietly but insistently, is whether a man trained to preserve balance can survive a moment that demands absolute decision, and what happens to a kingdom when its king is forced to act faster than his world was designed to allow. Once Harold is king, he does not rule from a throne so much as from the road. This is not unusual for an English ruler, but the scale and urgency are new. Harold's reign unfolds largely while moving between shires, along coastlines, across rivers and old Roman roads that still stubbornly shape England's geography. Kingship in 1066 is not sedentary. Authority must be seen to exist, and Harold understands this instinctively. In the early months, his movements are measured. He visits key regions, attends councils, confirms loyalties. He listens more than he speaks. This is not indecision, it is calibration. He is learning what sort of king England expects him to be and how much pressure each part of the system can absorb. At the same time, he prepares for war. The southern coast becomes a line of quiet vigilance. Lookouts watch the sea. Beacons are checked and repaired, simple structures, piles of wood and pitch meant to be lit in warning. Harold knows the system is imperfect. Messages still travel at the speed of men on horseback. Storms obscure sightlines, but it is what England has, and it has worked before. The fleet is assembled again, larger than before. Ships are pulled from rivers and estuaries, crews summoned from coastal communities. This is not a professional navy. These are working boats, fishing vessels adapted for war, crewed by men whose lives are tied to tides and seasons. They are capable, but they are not built for prolonged standoff. And so they wait. Waiting is harder than fighting. Supplies must be consumed without gain. Discipline frays. Men begin to worry about crops left untended. Harold rides among them, reminding, reassuring, urging patience. He cannot order them to remain forever. His authority is strong but not absolute. As summer stretches on and no invasion comes, Harold makes the pragmatic decision to stand down much of the force. The ships are sent back. The men return to their lives. England exhales slightly. This is the moment later chroniclers will circle, pointing to it as the hinge on which history turned. But at the time, it is simply governance. A king cannot rule a starving country into safety. Then the North erupts, and patience is replaced by urgency. The invasion by Harold Hardrada is not a rumor or a distant threat. It is immediate and destructive. The defeat at Fulford shocks the kingdom. York, a critical city, falls. Northern England feels exposed, vulnerable in a way it has not in decades. Harold's response is immediate and exhausting. He gathers his household troops, the best trained, most loyal men at his disposal, and marches north with relentless speed. This march becomes part of his legend, but it is also part of his burden. Speed is achieved by leaving things behind: supplies, slower men, caution. You can imagine the road, dust, sweat, the sound of armor shifting with each step, the knowledge that every mile gained now might save days later. Harold rides at the front, visible, setting the pace. A king on horseback is harder to abandon. The victory at Stamford Bridge is decisive, almost shockingly so. The Norwegian army is destroyed. 2 kings fall. The threat from the north is erased in a single day of violence. But Harold does not linger to celebrate. Even as bodies are counted and the wounded tended, messages arrive from the south. William has landed. Castles are going up. The invasion Harold feared most is now real. Here, Harold faces the most difficult decision of his reign. He could consolidate the north, secure loyalty, rest his army, gather fresh forces. Or he could turn immediately south, striking William before Norman control hardens. Both choices carry danger. Delay gives William time. Speed risks exhaustion. Harold chooses speed again. The return march south is harder than the march north. Men are injured, horses are tired, supplies are thinner. Some forces are dismissed, others cannot keep up. By the time Harold reaches the south, his army is smaller and worn. Still, it is not insignificant. Harold commands experienced fighters, men who have just tasted victory. Confidence travels with them, even fatigue. What Harold does not have is time to fully reset his strategy. William is not a raider. He does not intend to loot and leave. He builds fortifications immediately, staking a claim in earth and timber. He ravages the surrounding land deliberately, not out of cruelty alone, but to provoke. Harold cannot ignore this. A king who allows his land to be burned unchallenged risks losing loyalty quickly. So Harold advances. As he moves toward Hastings, messages go out calling up local forces. The Fiat answers as best it can. Men arrive with whatever weapons they own: spears, axes, shields. Some are well equipped, others are not. But they come because this is their land, their king, and their moment. Harold chooses his ground carefully. He takes position on a ridge, forcing William to attack uphill. This is sound tactics, conservative and practical. It plays to English strengths: defensive infantry, shield walls, endurance. In this, you see the King Harold has become. Not reckless, not romantic, practical, experienced. A man trying to win by minimizing risk rather than embracing spectacle. But risk remains. William's army is different. It includes cavalry, archers, professional soldiers trained for complex maneuvers. It is not inherently superior, but it is flexible in ways the English force is not. Harold knows this. He relies on discipline to compensate. The night before battle is quiet in the way nights before great violence often are. Men sleep fitfully. Equipment is checked and rechecked. Priests move among the ranks. Harold is there, visible, speaking to his men. He reminds them of home, of defense, of duty. There is no grand speech recorded, only the understanding that tomorrow will decide everything. In the morning, the battle begins. And here, the story of Harold's kingship tightens into its final test. Every choice he has made: speed over rest, defense over delay, acceptance over doubt, converges on this field. The fighting is brutal and prolonged. The English shield wall holds for hours. Norman assaults break and reform. The ground becomes slick with blood and mud. Men fall, are stepped over, replaced. There is no clear turning point at first, only grinding attrition. Harold fights as a king should in this world: present, exposed, vulnerable. He does not withdraw to safety. His authority depends on being seen. When the moment comes when Harold is struck down, whether by arrow or blade, the collapse is not immediate, but it is inevitable. Leadership in this system is personal. Without the king, the army loses its anchor. By nightfall, the field belongs to William. Harold's body is found among the dead, identified, it is said, by marks known only to those close to him. The crown he wore is gone, but the weight of it lingers. In less than a year, Harold has gone from earl to king to memory. His reign is short, but it is not empty. It represents the final assertion of an English kingship shaped by local custom, collective consent, and practical governance. What remains unresolved is not whether Harold failed. History is rarely that simple, but whether any man, ruling the system he inherited, could have acted differently enough to change the outcome. When the fighting ends, it does not end cleanly. The field near Hastings is quiet only in the way exhaustion creates silence. The cries fade first, then the movement. Men who can still stand search for friends, for leaders, for meaning in what has just happened. The ground is churned into something barely recognizable as land at all. Shields lie splintered. Weapons are half buried in mud. Bodies mark where lines once held. Harold Godwinson is dead. For those who fought beside him, this fact does not immediately feel real. Kings do not simply disappear, they anchor reality itself. Many men keep fighting for a while, driven by momentum and disbelief. Others break and flee. Some stand frozen, unsure what loyalty even means without a king to attach it to. Leadership in England has always been personal, and here, its fragility is laid bare. Harold's death does not instantly end resistance, but it removes coherence. There is no clear successor on the field. His brothers fall nearby. The standard goes down. What remains of the army dissolves into individuals, each making a choice based on fear, survival, or stubbornness. William of Normandy does not immediately claim total victory either. He is cautious. He knows that winning a battle is not the same as winning a kingdom. He secures the field, tends to his wounded, and prepares for what comes next. His control at this moment is real but narrow. News travels north and west with uneven speed. In villages and towns, people hear fragments. The king has fallen, the battle is lost, the Normans are coming. Some refuse to believe it. Others prepare to submit. A few prepare to resist, not because they think they can win, but because habit and pride are hard to abandon. Harold's body becomes a symbol almost immediately. Accounts differ on how it is identified: by wounds, by armor, by intimate marks known only to those close to him. These details matter because they anchor loss in certainty. England does not lose a king in rumor, it loses him in flesh. He is buried eventually, though where and how becomes uncertain. Some traditions place him in a monastery he founded. Others suggest a more anonymous resting place. This ambiguity mirrors his legacy: central, powerful, and yet oddly easy for history to blur. In the days that follow, England does not collapse. This is another important truth. Systems persist even when kings die. Sheriffs still collect taxes. Monasteries still ring bells. Fields still need tending. Ordinary life continues because it must. But something has shifted. Harold was the final expression of a particular kind of English rulership, one grounded in consensus, familiarity, and deeply local authority. He ruled not as a distant monarch, but as a first among powerful peers, bound by custom and expectation. His kingship made sense within England's existing rhythms. William's rule will not. In this sense, Harold's death marks not just the end of a reign, but the end of an era. The conquest that follows will reshape landholding, language, architecture, law, and memory. None of this is immediate and none of it is clean. But it begins here, on a field where a king dies doing what his world expects of him, standing visibly, fighting personally, refusing to retreat. Harold's choices in 1066 are often judged with the benefit of hindsight. He marched too fast. He fought too soon. He failed to wait. These criticisms assume options that may not have existed in practice. England's political system did not reward hesitation. A king who allowed invasion to go unchallenged risked rebellion and collapse from within. Harold ruled as he had learned to rule, by managing pressure, responding quickly, and trusting that decisive action would preserve stability. That this strategy failed against the unique convergence of 1066 does not make it irrational, it makes it tragically insufficient. There is also the matter of legitimacy. Harold was accepted by England. That mattered deeply to him and to those he governed. His claim rested on election, experience, and continuity. William's claim rested on oath, inheritance, and divine sanction. These are not arguments that can be reconciled easily. They represent two different political worlds colliding. Harold never had the chance to adapt fully to that collision. His reign is too short. His learning curve is too steep. He is forced to act at maximum intensity almost immediately without the luxury of consolidation. And yet his impact lingers. In later English memory, Harold becomes a figure of loss rather than failure. He is remembered as the last English king, the final defender of an old order. This memory simplifies him, strips away complexity, but preserves something important: the sense that England did not surrender itself willingly. For ordinary people, Harold's death is not about dynasties, it is about disruption. Land will change hands, new lords will arrive, new languages will dominate courts and documents, customs will be questioned, some will adapt, others will resist quietly, a few will lose everything. The weight of the crown Harold carried does not vanish with him. It transfers unevenly, imperfectly to a new ruler who must now learn to govern a land that did not choose him. And perhaps this is the most enduring lesson of Harold Godwinson's life and death, that competence and legitimacy are not always enough when history accelerates beyond the limits of existing systems. A man can do nearly everything right, according to the rules he knows, and still be overwhelmed by forces larger than any individual. When you look back on Harold's story, it is tempting to see inevitability. But inevitability is something we impose after outcomes are known. For those living through 1066, nothing felt certain until it was irreversible. Harold wakes one morning as king of a stable kingdom. By the end of the year, he is a fallen ruler in a conquered land. Between those points lies not destiny, but a series of human decisions made under pressure, with incomplete information, and with the sincere belief that they were necessary. England will go on. It always does. But it will do so changed, layered with new structures built atop old ones, carrying the quiet memory of a king who ruled briefly, fought fiercely, and bore the full weight of a crown that history had already begun to reshape. And as the Normans begin to move inland, securing their hold and rewriting the rules of power, one question lingers beneath the noise of conquest and submission. When a society changes rulers by force, how much of its past truly disappears and how much waits, quietly, to reassert itself generations later? Story 3. William of Normandy and a Distant Claim. Before William becomes the Conqueror, before England reshapes his name into something vast and final, he is simply William, Duke of Normandy, ruling a land that has taught him, from childhood, that power is never guaranteed. You begin his story not in triumph, but in uncertainty. William is born around 1028, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert of Normandy and a woman named Herleva, likely the daughter of a tanner. This fact shadows him for most of his life. In a world obsessed with lineage and legitimacy, being born outside of marriage is not a minor detail. It is a permanent vulnerability. His enemies will never let him forget it. Even his supporters sometimes hesitate. When William is still a child, his father leaves on pilgrimage and dies on the journey. Normandy is left in the hands of a boy not yet 10 years old. What follows is not a smooth regency, but years of violence, intrigue, and betrayal. Guardians are murdered. Nobles revolt. Castles change hands. Loyalty is transactional and temporary. This is the environment that shapes William. He grows up knowing that authority must be enforced, not assumed. That mercy has limits. That survival often requires decisiveness bordering on brutality. Where Harold Godwinson learns patience and consensus, William learns suspicion and control. Normandy itself is different from England. It is younger, more militarized, more accustomed to internal conflict. Castles dominate the landscape wooden at first, then increasingly stone. Knights form a warrior elite trained from youth for mounted combat. Lords expect to fight, and to fight often. William does not inherit a peaceful duchy, he earns it. By his late teens and early 20s, he is fighting rebellions personally. At Val's Dunes, with support from the French king, he crushes a coalition of Norman nobles who challenge his authority. The victory is decisive not just militarily, but psychologically. William demonstrates that he can survive violence and deliver it. From that point on, his rule hardens. Rebellions still occur, but they become more dangerous for those who attempt them. Lands are confiscated. Rivals are exiled or killed. William cultivates loyalty carefully, rewarding service with land and titles, but always ensuring that no single noble becomes too powerful. This constant management of power gives William a reputation. To some, he is harsh. To others, he is just. To most, he is formidable. Normandy stabilizes under his rule, becoming one of the most efficient and tightly controlled territories in Western Europe. It also becomes outward-looking. Normandy's nobles expect opportunities beyond their borders. They are restless, ambitious, trained for war. William understands that external conquest can serve internal stability. A lord fighting abroad is not rebelling at home. New lands can be redistributed to reward loyalty and bind followers more tightly to the duke. England enters this picture gradually. William's connection to England begins not as a plan of conquest, but as a web of family ties and political familiarity. King Edward of England spent much of his youth in Normandy. Norman clerics and advisors move between the two courts. The Channel is a boundary, but not a barrier. At some point exactly when is unclear, William comes to believe that Edward has promised him the English throne. From William's perspective, this promise fits neatly into his worldview. He is Edward's kin. He is powerful. He is legitimate in continental terms. England, wealthy and organized, represents both prestige and opportunity. But promises in medieval politics are rarely simple. Edward is a cautious man, and England is not Normandy. Even if Edward spoke of William as a potential successor, such words could not bind the English nobility or the church definitively. William, however, is accustomed to a more centralized model of authority. In his world, a ruler's word carries enormous weight. This difference in political culture matters deeply. When Harold Godwinson appears in Normandy years later, whether as envoy, accident, or captive, William interprets the encounter through his own framework. Harold is not just a noble, he is a representative of English power. When Harold swears an oath, William hears confirmation. Harold likely hears something else entirely. Whatever the truth, William emerges from the encounter convinced that his claim to England is legitimate, personal, and sacred. When Edward dies and Harold is crowned, William does not see a political decision made by a council. He sees betrayal. And betrayal in William's world demands response. Yet William does not rush blindly into invasion. This is another misconception. He is methodical, patient, and acutely aware of logistics. Conquering England is not a raid. It is an enormous undertaking. First, he must secure support at home. Norman nobles will not follow him out of loyalty alone. They must be promised land, titles, and reward. William makes these promises carefully, parceling out England on parchment before a single ship sails. This future vision binds men to him more effectively than fear ever could. Second, he must secure legitimacy beyond Normandy. An invasion framed as naked aggression risks opposition from other powers, especially France. William therefore pursues moral authority. He sends envoys to Rome. He presents his case carefully. An oath broken, a rightful claim denied, a kingdom in need of correction. The papacy, increasingly interested in reform and influence, listens. Whether the Pope fully understands English political nuance is doubtful. What matters is that William receives symbolic support, a banner, a blessing, something he can present as divine approval. In a deeply religious age, this transforms invasion into righteous action. Third, William must prepare materially. Ships must be built or gathered in enormous numbers. Horses must be transported across the channel, no small feat. Supplies must be stockpiled. This preparation takes months. Normandy becomes a landscape of quiet readiness, timber cut, sails sewn, weapons sharpened. Throughout this period, William waits. He waits for favorable winds. He waits for Harold to exhaust himself. He waits for the right moment when England is vulnerable but not yet united against him. This waiting is not passive. It is deliberate, strategic patience shaped by years of hard-earned survival. When the wind finally turns, William acts decisively. But that moment when sails finally fill, when Normandy empties itself into the channel, belongs to the next phase of the story. For now, what matters is the man himself. William is not driven by impulse. He is driven by memory of childhood insecurity, of fragile authority, of promises made and enforced through strength. England, to him, is not just a prize. It is proof that legitimacy can be seized, confirmed, and made permanent through conquest. As you stand with William on the Norman coast, looking out across the narrow strip of water that separates ambition from reality, the claim to England no longer feels distant. It feels inevitable in his mind, overdue, and morally justified. The question that remains unresolved is not whether William believes he deserves England, but whether belief, however carefully constructed, can survive the chaos of crossing into a land that has not agreed to be claimed. Along the Norman coast, the summer of 1066 is defined not by action, but by delay. Ports like Divy-sur-Mer and St. Valery-sur-Somme fill with ships pulled up onto mudflats and beaches. Some are purpose-built transports, but many are ordinary vessels adapted for war: fishing boats, cargo ships, river craft dragged down to the sea. Sails are repaired and re-repaired. Ropes are coiled, uncoiled, and checked again. Horses are walked daily to keep them fit, their nervous energy matching that of the men who will soon depend on them. This waiting is not idle, but it is uncomfortable. William's army is large by the standards of the time, drawn not only from Normandy but from across northern France and beyond. Breton warriors, Flemish mercenaries, men from Maine and Anjou all gather under William's banner. They speak different dialects, follow different customs, and carry different expectations. Holding such a force together without fighting is a delicate task. William moves constantly among them. He listens to grievances. He reassures anxious nobles. He reminds them of promised English lands, fertile fields, prosperous towns, estates larger than anything they currently possess. These promises are not vague. They are specific, carefully calibrated to loyalty and rank. William understands that men fight best when they can imagine exactly what they are fighting for. But even the most disciplined army frays under delay. Supplies dwindle. Discipline requires enforcement. Petty disputes flare into violence. Men grumble about omens, about the stubborn wind that refuses to turn south. Medieval armies are deeply attentive to signs, and the weather feels personal. Some wonder aloud whether God truly favors this endeavor. William cannot afford doubt. He responds with a mixture of piety and control. Prayers are ordered, fast days observed. Clergy emphasize the righteousness of the cause. The papal banner is displayed prominently, a constant visual reminder that this invasion carries spiritual endorsement. At the same time, William does not hesitate to assert authority. Discipline is maintained. Theft and disorder are punished. The army remains intact, waiting for the moment it can finally move. Across the Channel, Harold Godwinson is also waiting, though not in the same way. England's defenses have been mobilized and stood down. Men have returned home. Fields demand attention. Harold's attention is divided, pulled north and south by rumor and uncertainty. William knows this. He has good intelligence. Traders cross the Channel regularly. Information flows both ways. William is aware that England cannot remain fully mobilized indefinitely. Time, in this sense, favors the invader. Still, time is also dangerous. An army gathered too long becomes expensive and unstable. Allies grow impatient. Rivals at home watch closely. Normandy itself cannot be neglected forever. William's authority, though strong, is not immune to strain. And then there is the sea. The Channel is narrow, but it is treacherous. Winds shift unpredictably. Storms rise quickly. Ships overloaded with men and horses are vulnerable. A failed crossing could destroy William's army before it ever reaches England. This is why William waits for near-perfect conditions. Finally, in late September, the wind changes. The moment is almost anticlimactic. There is no thunder, no divine voice, just a steady, favorable breeze. But William recognizes it instantly. Orders go out. The waiting ends. What follows is controlled chaos. Men scramble aboard ships. Horses are loaded carefully. Slings used to hoist them into holds or onto reinforced decks. Weapons are stowed. Standards are packed away to be raised later. Priests bless the fleet. Final prayers are spoken. William himself boards his ship, the Mara, reportedly a gift from his wife Matilda. It is larger and more ornate than many others, with a gilded figurehead. This is not vanity alone. It is symbolism. A leader must be seen. As the fleet sets out, something unusual happens. William's ship outpaces the rest, moving ahead into open water. For a time, it sails alone, the rest of the fleet lagging behind. Those aboard grow uneasy. Has the fleet been scattered? Has the crossing failed already? William responds calmly. He orders the ship to anchor and waits. This small moment is telling. It reflects his temperament precisely. He does not rush ahead without support. He does not panic. He waits until the fleet regroups, then continues together. Control matters more than speed. The crossing itself is remarkably smooth. This is often overlooked because what follows is so dramatic, but the sea does not resist William. The fleet arrives intact on the English coast at Pevensey. Not a single ship is lost, according to later accounts. For a medieval invasion of this scale, this is extraordinary. The landing is careful and deliberate. Men disembark. Horses are led ashore, shaky but unharmed. Supplies are unloaded. Defensive positions are established almost immediately. William does not assume England will greet him passively. He prepares for resistance from the first hour. The location matters. Pevensey sits within the ruins of an old Roman fort, its stone walls long abandoned but still imposing. William recognizes their value. He reuses the landscape, layering Norman fortification onto Roman bones. This habit, building new power atop old structures, will become a defining feature of Norman rule. From Pevensey, William moves to Hastings, where he establishes another stronghold. These are not castles in the later stone sense, but fortified positions, earthworks, timber palisades built quickly by experienced hands. They are statements of intent as much as defenses. William's army does not wander, it does not disperse, it consolidates. This discipline distinguishes the Norman invasion from earlier Viking raids. William is not here to loot and leave. He is here to stay. Every action reinforces that reality. The countryside around Hastings suffers. William allows, even encourages, the ravaging of land. Crops are burned, livestock taken. This is not random cruelty. It is strategy. The destruction provokes Harold into action. A king cannot ignore such damage without losing authority. William wants Harold to come to him. And Harold does. As William settles in, he waits again, but this time on English soil. Scouts move constantly. Messengers ride back and forth. William positions his forces carefully, choosing ground that offers visibility and room to maneuver. When news arrives that Harold is marching south at speed, William is ready. What matters here is not just that William has invaded England, but how he has done so. Every step reflects a man shaped by instability and survival. He does not trust chance. He does not rely on goodwill. He creates conditions that force his opponent to react. William's claim to England may have begun as a promise spoken years earlier, but it is now being enforced through methodical preparation, psychological pressure, and disciplined violence. The invasion is not impulsive. It is the culmination of decades of learning how power is taken, held, and legitimized. As the two armies move toward each other, England becomes a narrowing stage. Roads fill with men. Villages watch silently. Fields lie trampled. The ordinary rhythms of life are suspended, replaced by the slow approach of confrontation. William knows that the coming battle will not merely decide a crown. It will decide whether his entire life's strategy, his belief in earned authority, enforced legitimacy, and decisive action can triumph over a system built on consensus and familiarity. Standing near Hastings, surrounded by men who have followed him across the sea, William prepares for the moment when belief must survive contact with reality. The unresolved question now is not whether William can fight. He has done that all his life, but whether conquest alone can transform a foreign land into a stable kingdom, or whether England will resist him in ways that no battlefield victory can fully settle. When the two armies finally face one another, there is no sense, at least not for those standing on the ground, that this moment will echo for centuries. There is only the practical awareness that survival now depends on discipline, position, and endurance. William rises early on the morning of the battle. He attends mass. He speaks with his commanders. He ensures his men are fed as well as circumstances allow. These actions are deliberate, almost ritualistic. They steady the army and reaffirm hierarchy. A leader who maintains routine on the edge of catastrophe signals control. The Norman army forms in three main divisions: Normans in the center, Bretons on one flank, French and Flemish contingents on the other. This arrangement is not accidental. William places his most trusted forces where he can personally oversee them, while still binding his allies into the effort. Across the field, Harold's army waits behind its shield wall, packed tightly along the ridge. William studies them carefully. He sees no cavalry, few archers. He sees determination, but also rigidity. This is an army built to hold ground, not to adapt quickly. William's challenge is clear: break a defense designed not to break. The battle begins with missile fire. Norman archers step forward, losing arrows uphill. Most are ineffective at first, glancing off shields or burying themselves harmlessly in the earth. The English hold. William watches, measuring response rather than forcing outcome. Next comes infantry, then cavalry. Norman horsemen charge the slope, only to be repelled by the dense shield wall. Men and horses fall. Momentum breaks. For a moment, the invasion itself seems to falter. This is the most dangerous phase for William. At one point, a rumor spreads that he has been killed. Panic ripples through part of the army. This is the nightmare of any medieval commander: collapse through misinformation. William responds instantly. He rides forward, lifts his helmet, and shows his face. He is alive. He is present. He is in command. This act matters more than any maneuver. Authority is restored through visibility. The fighting continues hour after hour. Attacks are launched, repelled, reformed. The English hold their line stubbornly. The Normans test, retreat, regroup. The ground becomes slick. Fatigue accumulates. What decides the battle is not a single brilliant stroke, but attrition mental and physical. William adapts. Whether by design or opportunity, Norman forces begin feigned retreats. Parts of the English line pursue, breaking formation. When this happens, Norman cavalry wheels back, cutting down those who have left the shield wall. Each small break weakens the whole. William does not abandon caution. He commits resources carefully, reinforcing success rather than chasing spectacle. This is a pattern learned over decades of survival. He knows that overextension kills more leaders than hesitation. As the day wears on, the English defense erodes, not dramatically but incrementally. Gaps appear, shields splinter, men who have stood for hours begin to slow. When Harold is struck, however it happens, the loss is decisive not because he falls, but because he cannot be replaced. William presses the advantage, but not recklessly. He secures the field before nightfall. He does not pursue fugitives deep into unfamiliar terrain. Victory, for him, is not just about winning the battle. It is about preserving the army that must now conquer a kingdom. After the battle, William waits again. He does not rush to London. He does not declare immediate kingship. Instead, he consolidates. He secures supply lines. He builds fortifications. He sends messages both threatening and conciliatory. He allows time for England's leadership to absorb the shock of defeat. This patience is calculated. England does not surrender immediately. Some regions submit quickly, others hesitate, a few resist. William responds with a mixture of force and negotiation. Towns that submit are spared. Those that resist face punishment. The pattern is clear, repeated deliberately. When William is finally crowned king on Christmas Day 1066, the ceremony is tense. The congregation's acclamation is misunderstood by Norman guards outside, who believe an uprising has begun. Fires break out nearby. The moment meant to symbolize unity instead reveals how fragile that unity still is. William notices. Kingship, he understands, is not complete at coronation. It must be enforced daily. England is wealthier and more complex than Normandy. Its systems are sophisticated. Its people are not accustomed to absolute rule. William adapts again, retaining much of England's administrative structure while placing Normans at the top. This is how the conquest truly takes hold, not in one battle, but in thousands of decisions about land, law, language, and loyalty. William's distant claim has now become a lived reality. He rules England not as a visitor but as a resident power. Castles rise. Lands are redistributed. The English elite is reshaped, not entirely destroyed but subordinated. For William personally, the conquest validates everything he believes about power. Authority can be seized, defended, and normalized. Legitimacy can be constructed through success. Doubt, once eradicated, does not easily return. But the cost is permanent change. England does not become Normandy. Normandy does not disappear into England. Instead, something new forms, layered, tense, adaptive. Old customs survive under new masters. New laws grow out of old frameworks. Language itself shifts, slowly, unevenly. William achieves his crown, but not peace. His reign will be marked by rebellion, suppression, and constant vigilance. He will spend much of his life crossing the Channel, managing two realms that never fully merge. Looking back, it is tempting to see William's success as inevitable, the triumph of discipline over disorder. But inevitability hides the fragile moments, the waiting for wind, the rumor of death, the narrow margins on a muddy hillside. William's conquest succeeds not because it was destined, but because it was relentlessly managed by a man who never forgot how easily power could be lost. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of his story, that claims, no matter how distant or abstract, only become history when someone is willing to endure uncertainty long enough to impose order, and then live with the consequences of having done so. As England adjusts to its new king, and a foreign elite settles uneasily into an old land, another question begins to form beneath the surface. How will the people of England, those far from courts and castles, experience this change in their daily lives? And what new pressures will the conquest place on those least able to resist it? Story 4. The North remembers Harold Hardrada and the Norwegian invasion. Long before Harold Hardrada sets foot in England, long before his name is spoken with alarm in English halls, his life has already stretched across much of the known world. His claim to England does not grow from a single promise or a tidy lineage, but from memory old, persistent, and northern, and from a personal history shaped almost entirely by war. To understand why Harold believes England might be his, you must begin far from York, far even from Norway itself. Harold is born around 1015, half a century before 1066, into a Norway still defining itself. Kingship in Scandinavia is not yet stable or hereditary in the way it will later become. Authority is contested, personal, and violent. Harold learns early that power is taken and held, not inherited peacefully. As a young man, Harold fights beside his half-brother, King Olaf II of Norway. When Olaf is defeated and killed at the Battle of Stiklestad, Harold is wounded and forced into exile. He is barely 15 years old. This exile defines him. Harold does not drift quietly into obscurity. Instead, he travels east, into the tangled world of Kievan Rus, and from there further south to Constantinople. There, he enters the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of foreign warriors who serve the Byzantine emperor. These men are valued precisely because they are outsiders fiercely loyal, unconnected to local politics, and accustomed to violence. For years, Harold fights across the Mediterranean world. He campaigns in Sicily, in North Africa, in the Balkans. He guards emperors, suppresses rebellions, sacks cities. He accumulates not just experience, but wealth. Sagas later exaggerate his riches, but there is little doubt that Harold returns north a rich man by Scandinavian standards. More importantly, he returns transformed. Where William of Normandy learns discipline and control through internal rebellion, Harold learns adaptability through constant movement. He commands men who do not share his language. He fights in unfamiliar terrain. He negotiates with emperors and mercenaries alike. By the time he leaves Byzantine service, Harold is not just a Viking king in waiting, he is an international war leader. When Harold finally returns to Scandinavia, he claims the throne of Norway through force and negotiation. His reign is assertive and often harsh. He centralizes power. He crushes rivals. He earns the nickname Hardrada, hard ruler, or hard counsel, not as flattery, but as acknowledgement. Norway under Harold is stable, but it is also restless. Like many Scandinavian rulers, Harold looks outward. Expansion is not just ambition, it is tradition. England, in particular, looms large in Scandinavian memory. It has been ruled by Danish kings within living memory. The North Sea world remains interconnected by trade, travel, and story. This is where Harold's claim emerges. Through a series of treaties and successions, complex, overlapping, and deeply medieval, Harold comes to believe that he has a legitimate right to the English throne. These claims pass through Danish kings, agreements made decades earlier, and the idea that England is part of a broader northern political sphere. From an English perspective, these claims feel distant and obsolete. From Harold's perspective, they are unfinished business. When Edward the Confessor dies and Harold Godwinson takes the throne, Harold sees opportunity. England has chosen a king quickly, but not one universally acknowledged. Succession disputes create openings. Harold has spent his entire life exploiting such openings. He does not act alone. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, arrives at Harold's court. Bitter, wronged, and well-informed, Tostig offers something invaluable: insight into England's defenses and politics. He promises support in the north. He frames the invasion not just as conquest, but as correction. Harold listens. He is not impulsive, but he is confident. He has led armies longer than William of Normandy has ruled Normandy. He has fought in harsher conditions, farther from home. England, to Harold, does not feel distant or intimidating. It feels familiar. Preparation begins. Harold assembles a large fleet, drawing on Norway's maritime strength. His ships are purpose-built for war and transport, long tested in North Sea crossings. His army includes experienced warriors, men accustomed to campaigning, to living off land and sea. Unlike William, Harold does not seek papal approval. He does not need it. His legitimacy comes from northern tradition, from strength, from precedent. This difference matters. Harold does not frame his invasion as moral correction, but as rightful claim and warrior enterprise. The fleet sails west, stopping in the Orkneys to gather more men. This pause is not accidental. The Orkneys are a Scandinavian stronghold, culturally and politically aligned with Harold. From here, the invasion feels less like foreign adventure and more like regional enforcement. When Harold reaches the English coast, he does not land in the south. He goes north, where Scandinavian influence has always been strongest. The north remembers Denmark. It remembers Norse rule. It is farther from London, farther from immediate royal response. At first, the campaign goes well. Local resistance is scattered. Harold's forces move inland. Tostig's presence helps secure allies or at least neutralize opposition. The battle at Fulford is a victory for the invaders. English forces there are defeated. York submits. For a moment, it appears that Harold's gamble has paid off. But Harold, for all his experience, underestimates one thing: Harold Godwinson's speed. Harold believes he has time to consolidate, time to secure the north before facing the full weight of English response. This assumption is reasonable. Medieval armies do not usually move as fast as Harold's will. And so Harold waits near Stamford Bridge, confident, victorious, and unprepared for what is coming. The unresolved tension here is subtle but fatal. Can a king whose life has been defined by mobility and adaptability afford even a short pause? And what happens when two leaders, both shaped by relentless warfare, misjudge each other's limits? Harold Hardrada had won the north of England before Harold Godwinson could even react. York had opened its gates, Fulford had fallen, and the Norwegian king felt the quiet satisfaction of a campaign progressing as planned. The land seemed to bend to his experience. After decades of campaigning in distant lands, from the frozen fjords of Norway to the sun-baked hills of Sicily, Harold believed he could outmaneuver any opponent. And yet, he underestimated Harold Godwinson's capacity for speed, endurance, and surprise. The English king had marched north after Stamford Bridge and Fulford's fall, covering incredible distance in just 4 days. The army was exhausted, yet disciplined. Soldiers had little time to eat, sleep, or rest, but their loyalty and coordination carried them through. Harold himself rode at the forefront, visible and commanding, embodying the principle that a king leads from the front. When Harold's scouts reported movement in the south, he did not immediately recognize its significance. The English army had been mobilized and dispersed earlier in the year, after coastal threats seemed to vanish. Now it appeared suddenly, a tidal wave of men who had crossed long distances in astonishing time. Harold's confidence was shaken, but his pride would not allow hesitation. Stamford Bridge, an old Roman site near York, became the stage for confrontation. Harold and Tostig's forces numbered roughly 15,000 men, a mix of Norse veterans and Levite troops. Harold's army, while exhausted, was cohesive and motivated. The two forces faced one another across a river, separated by bridges and marshy ground, a landscape that would prove decisive. The morning of September 25, 1066, begins with tension but not panic. Harold and Tostig prepare their men, distributing weapons, assigning positions, and issuing orders. They assume that they will fight a battle similar to the campaigns Harold has commanded countless times before: careful maneuvering, attritional skirmishes, and a decisive clash that favors the experienced warriors. The English army arrives almost silently. Their approach is hidden by the geography, a combination of forested slopes and the poor lines of sight typical of northern England. Harold does not signal or parade. Instead, he positions his men for maximum impact, concentrating forces and taking advantage of terrain that the Norwegians thought would be secure. When the attack comes, it is sudden and complete. Harold's men are caught largely unprepared. The bridge across the river becomes a choke point. Norwegian soldiers, some still in mail, some in partial armor after a morning inspection, struggle to organize. The English attack is ferocious but methodical. They know the ground, they know their enemy, and they exploit every weakness. The battle is savage. Harold's forces, though battle-hardened, are forced into defensive positions they did not choose. The English shield wall advances steadily. Norwegian lines crumble where the terrain funnels them. Resistance is fierce, but the cohesion of the English army proves decisive. One critical detail lingers in accounts. Harold had left a contingent on guard at the bridge. When English forces force the crossing, these men fight to the death. Harold himself reportedly enters the fray, striking as a warrior king, but the sheer numbers and discipline of the English overwhelm him. Within hours, the Norwegians are defeated. Harold Hardrada dies on the battlefield. His life of campaigns, victories, and distant exploits ends not in Sicily, not in Constantinople, but in northern England. Tostig is also killed. The remnants of the army flee to their ships, leaving behind men, weapons, and the illusion of invincibility. The victory at Stamford Bridge is total, yet it comes at a cost. The English army is exhausted from the forced march. Men have been away from home, fighting far from familiar supply lines under intense pressure. Victory does not leave them rested. It leaves them vigilant, aware that another threat looms in the south. Harold cannot celebrate, cannot rest, cannot consolidate. He must immediately pivot to face William of Normandy, who has landed with a fresh and ready army. The lesson of Stamford Bridge is subtle but profound. Momentum is fragile. Even the most experienced commander, even a king with decades of victories, can be undone by speed, timing, and terrain. Experience matters, but it does not guarantee adaptability to unexpected developments. Even a Hardrada, who has navigated Byzantine politics and Mediterranean warfare, cannot anticipate everything in a land that is foreign in climate, culture, and circumstance. In these hours, England has been spared foreign occupation in the north, but not yet conquest. The victory stabilizes Harold's northern flank, but at what cost to the south? His men are weary. His resources are stretched thin. He has won one war while another waits at the coast. Time and distance, previously allies, now work against him. Harold's death closes one chapter but opens another, the larger confrontation that will decide not just kings, but the very future of England. The aftermath at Stamford Bridge is a reminder that history rarely rewards brilliance alone. Luck, timing, and endurance all play equal roles. And the unresolved tension remains. How much can a kingdom endure when its king moves faster than history itself seems designed to allow? And what happens when victory in one place forces vulnerability in another? The victory at Stamford Bridge should have been England's moment of triumph. Harold Godwinson's rapid march north, his army's endurance, and the sudden destruction of Harold Hardrada's forces represent one of the most remarkable military feats of the medieval world. Yet in history's careful ledger, triumph often comes with hidden costs. By the time Harold surveys the battlefield, the English army is exhausted. Men who have fought, marched, and slept little are bloodied and weary. Horses are tired, weapons bent, shields splintered. Victory feels complete in principle but precarious in reality. Harold knows immediately that he cannot linger in the north. South, along the Sussex coast, a far larger and more organized threat has emerged: William of Normandy. News reaches Harold almost as soon as Stamford Bridge ends. William has landed at Pevensey. He is not raiding, not probing. He is building fortifications, staking a claim, and consolidating forces. The Normans are fresh, well-fed, and disciplined. They have not marched hundreds of miles in a matter of days, and their horses are ready for sustained combat. Harold faces a brutal calculus. He must march his exhausted troops south to meet William, a distance of roughly 200 miles, over rough terrain, with little time to rest or resupply. He must hold the line for his kingdom's survival while carrying the invisible weight of two battles fought almost simultaneously. In many ways, England itself hangs by his stamina. The march south is relentless. Chroniclers describe it as a feat of endurance bordering on the impossible. Men push their limits. Rivers, hills, and mud slow progress, but Harold drives forward with urgency, knowing that delay would allow William to entrench and grow stronger. Every hour matters. Every mile marched is an investment in survival. Arriving near Hastings, Harold surveys the enemy. William's fortifications are modest timber walls, earthworks but strategically placed. The Normans have used the coast, the surrounding hills, and the English landscape to their advantage. They have also practiced discipline and cohesion that the English army cannot yet match after the Northern campaign. When the two armies finally meet at Hastings on October 14, 1066, Harold's men are still carrying the physical and emotional weight of Stamford Bridge. The battle begins with the English shield wall holding strong against Norman archers. Hours pass, the fighting is fierce, and the terrain is brutal. Unlike Stamford Bridge, Harold cannot rely solely on momentum. Fatigue undermines discipline, and the Normans exploit every weakness. The psychological element is crucial. Soldiers who survived one miraculous victory now face a fresh, formidable opponent. Their king, visible and commanding as ever, does not falter, but the strain is palpable. England's fate rests on decisions made under extreme pressure, where every choice carries catastrophic consequences. As the day unfolds, minor errors compound. Feigned Norman retreats draw English soldiers from their defensive positions. Gaps emerge. Archers and cavalry exploit them. Then comes the fatal moment. Harold is struck, his life ending on the battlefield. Leadership collapses. Discipline breaks. The shield wall that defined English military tradition falters. The army is routed. William emerges victorious, but the conquest is far from complete. England is not instantly Norman. Resistance persists in pockets. Loyalty is uneven. The king is dead, but the kingdom remains a landscape of living people, farmers, merchants, and warriors who must adapt, resist, or survive under a new order. Harold Hardrada's invasion, though decisively defeated, is an essential prelude. It forced Harold Godwinson's army to exhaustion, leaving England vulnerable to William's methodical campaign. The convergence of these events demonstrates a stark truth about history. Success in one moment can generate vulnerability in the next. Triumph and disaster are often separated by little more than timing. From the perspective of ordinary Englishmen, the year 1066 is a whirlwind of sudden shifts. In the north, they saw the devastation of Scandinavian assault and the miraculous survival of Harold's army. In the south, they witnessed the arrival of a foreign power that would reshape governance, landholding, and law. Daily life fields, villages, markets now existed under the shadow of uncertainty and conquest. For leaders like William and Harold, timing, strategy, and endurance define outcomes. For those caught in between, survival requires adaptation, resilience, and acceptance that history can arrive suddenly and irrevocably. The story of 1066, when viewed through the lens of Stamford Bridge and Hastings together, reveals a world in which human decision-making, personal stamina, and logistical mastery converge to shape monumental outcomes. It is a reminder that kings, no matter how capable, are bounded by the limitations of their time, their armies, and their terrain. Even the mightiest warriors Harold Godwinson cannot escape the pressures imposed by distance, exhaustion, and chance. And so, England passes from one system of rule to another. The North remembers Harold's defeat and the devastation he brought. The South remembers William's landing and the fall of a king. Across the land, ordinary people adapt to new lords, new laws, and new realities. The year closes with both triumph and loss, revealing the delicate interplay between skill, timing, and fortune that defines human history. The unresolved question lingers quietly, almost beneath the noise of conquest. How does a society rebuild itself after two invasions in rapid succession? And what will survive of its old identity once the dust settles and foreign rule becomes entrenched? Story 5. The Lives of Ordinary Englishmen during 1066. When we think of 1066, our minds often fixate on kings, battles, and crowns. But most people living in England that year were not kings, not earls, and not even professional warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, laborers, and smallholders, men, women, and children whose daily lives were shaped by seasons, harvests, taxes, and the ever-present threat of violence. For them, history did not arrive as abstract events. It arrived in the form of disruption, fear, and relentless uncertainty. Imagine a village somewhere in Wessex. Its residents rise early, even as autumn approaches, to tend fields and livestock. Peasants may own no land at all, working instead as tenants or laborers on manorial estates. Their tools are simple: wooden plows, sickles, spades. They rely on shared knowledge passed down over generations, on weather patterns they can barely predict, and on the rhythm of the church bells to measure time. Life is physically demanding, unforgiving, and repetitive, but it is stable, predictable, and intimately connected to the land. This stability begins to erode in early 1066. Rumors spread of King Edward's impending death. The village hears whispers that a new ruler will be chosen, that foreign powers may intervene, that disputes over succession could bring conflict even to their small fields. These rumors are abstract, but the consequences are not. Uncertainty in leadership often leads to demands for extra levies, forced service in militias, and the requisition of food or horses. Families begin to sense that the familiar rhythm of planting and harvest may be interrupted by politics far beyond their control. Then comes the North. Stories filter south of Viking movements. Traders and travelers recount the arrival of Norwegian forces near York. Villagers hear of the defeat at Fulford, of the fall of York, of men killed and towns sacked. The English North is suddenly a place of chaos, distant but frightening. Families pray for protection, for divine favor, for the army they have never seen to succeed. For many, these are not political calculations, they are existential concerns. Even in the South, life is disrupted. Earl Harold Godwinson calls levies. Local men are conscripted to fight. Houses that once felt safe become depopulated as sons, husbands, and brothers march north. Women take on extra burdens, caring for livestock, mending clothing, and tending fields without help. Children observe adult fear in ways that imprint upon them permanently, shaping perceptions of authority, war, and mortality. The arrival of the Normans in the South adds a new layer of anxiety. Villagers notice unfamiliar banners and troops. Farmers must decide whether to flee, resist, or comply. Those who resist may face immediate violence. Those who submit may survive but lose property or autonomy. Every choice feels simultaneously moral and pragmatic. Daily survival becomes a form of political negotiation. Peasants must provide labor to lords who are themselves uncertain of the future. Craftsmen, such as blacksmiths and millers, continue work under the watchful eye of authorities who may be new, foreign, or unpredictable. Markets may shrink as trade routes are disrupted. Food shortages become possible not because of famine, but because armies consume livestock, requisition grain, and destroy fields to deny resources to their enemies. Even the church, a constant in everyday life, cannot provide full reassurance. Priests offer prayers and guidance, but cannot prevent death, raiding, or conscription. Some may preach obedience to a just ruler. Others may offer spiritual comfort to those left behind. In either case, religious authority coexists with the tangible realities of fear, loss, and scarcity. This combination of stressors, the physical, the social, and the psychological, creates a collective anxiety. Villagers are not passive observers. They adapt. They hide food. They fortify dwellings. They build temporary defenses. They form small, localized networks of mutual aid. Even in the absence of professional armies, human ingenuity and resilience persist. Winter approaches. Fields are trampled. Harvests are incomplete. Men return home exhausted, only to find that villages may have been pillaged, livestock taken, and storehouses emptied. Disease, always a quiet threat, becomes more pressing as nutrition and sanitation decline. Everyday life is simultaneously normal and extraordinary, punctuated by the presence of kings, battles, and armies moving through the countryside. And yet these ordinary lives continue. Families find ways to maintain routines. Bread is baked, fires are lit, tools repaired, children taught. They survive through labor, observation, and sheer persistence. In this context, history is not measured in victories and crowns alone, but in the capacity of ordinary people to endure and adapt to forces they cannot fully control. The unresolved tension is striking. While kings fight and die, and armies conquer or retreat, what happens to the social fabric of villages, towns, and fields? How does a society maintain continuity when every year could bring an invasion, a new ruler, or devastation to daily life? The ordinary, after all, must persist even when history accelerates violently around it. The year 1066 imposes an extraordinary burden on ordinary people. It is not simply a matter of witnessing kings rise and fall. It is about adapting to events that disrupt daily life in ways both immediate and subtle. Survival is as much a mental strategy as a physical one. Villagers and townspeople, often overlooked by chroniclers, navigate a world where armies, taxes, and rumors dictate the rhythm of existence. After Harold Godwinson's conscription calls, men leave villages to march north against Harold Hardrada. For those remaining, life becomes a balancing act. Women, elderly family members, and younger children must perform tasks previously handled by able-bodied men. Livestock must be herded and fed. Granaries must be guarded. Fields tilled, harvested, or protected from marauders. Every decision carries the weight of life or death, property or ruin. A single error, leaving a gate unbarred, storing food in an exposed location, could invite looters or opportunistic soldiers. Some communities develop rudimentary early warning systems. Lookouts are posted along hilltops, near rivers, and along frequently used roads. When scouts spot approaching forces, whether local militias, Norwegian raiders, or even Norman reconnaissance, the village mobilizes quietly. Women hide valuables, men form makeshift defensive units, and children are guided to safe locations. This vigilance is not formalized. It is a pattern of human adaptation to persistent threat, passed through observation and instruction rather than written law. Even when armies are absent, fear shapes behavior. Villagers avoid certain roads or fields, anticipating raids or conscription. Trade slows as markets empty and merchants hesitate to travel. Craftsmen, while continuing essential work, adjust production for scarcity. Blacksmiths conserve iron, carpenters reuse timber, and millers ration grain. These small acts of ingenuity reflect the quiet resilience of ordinary society, a thread of continuity amid chaos. The arrival of William's forces in the south amplifies disruption. Norman soldiers often requisition food, shelter, and labor. They demand obedience without negotiation. Peasants who comply are spared immediate harm. Those who resist risk beatings, destruction of property, or execution. Compliance, however, does not equate to acceptance. Communities develop tactics to maintain autonomy subtly, hiding resources, negotiating payments, or performing labor while minimizing losses. Survival becomes negotiation, and negotiation is a skill honed by necessity. Religion remains central, not merely as faith, but as a framework for interpreting the uncontrollable. Priests deliver blessings, organize prayers for protection, and sometimes mediate between invading forces and villagers. Churches, while sometimes targeted during campaigns, also function as storage sites, shelters, and centers for community resilience. In these spaces, ordinary people find structure and guidance amidst the upheaval of invasion and war. Some villagers engage in passive resistance. They conceal supplies from occupiers, maintain local customs despite imposed laws, and preserve oral histories that recount the Old England under Edward and Harold. This quiet defiance is often invisible to chroniclers, but it sustains culture and community identity. It is a testament to the agency of ordinary people. Even when kings and armies dominate the landscape, individuals exercise choices, however constrained, that shape their world. The cycle of threat and adaptation is relentless. After Stamford Bridge and the Norman landing, Englishmen face a dual reality: exhaustion from northern campaigns and the looming presence of fresh, organized forces in the south. Villages anticipate the movement of armies. Seasonal rhythms, planting, harvest, winter preparation must be maintained despite disruptions. Every action is calculated for continuity. Failure is costly, yet remarkably, life endures. Beyond immediate survival, communities also contend with longer-term consequences. Land may be redistributed to Norman lords, altering traditional farming obligations. Local leaders may be replaced or subordinated, creating tension within villages. Legal systems, taxation, and customary rights are rewritten to favor new rulers. Ordinary people must navigate these transitions while maintaining productivity, safety, and social cohesion. Adaptation is not just physical, it is legal, social, and psychological. In England's villages and towns, the events of 1066 are not abstract history, they are lived experience. They shape memory, identity, and the perception of authority. Children witness the collapse and reconstruction of leadership. Families adjust strategies for survival, internalizing lessons of caution, compliance, and negotiation. Communities develop resilience that will endure for generations. And yet, despite adaptation and resilience, uncertainty persists. Even the most vigilant village cannot anticipate every movement of armies, nor control the decisions of kings, earls, or foreign conquerors. Survival requires constant observation, flexibility, and judgment. This creates a persistent tension. Ordinary life continues, but always under the shadow of forces far beyond one's control. The unresolved thought lingers. How do ordinary people preserve continuity, culture, and identity when the very structures of society, the king, the nobles, the military, are in flux? What forms of resilience endure when history sweeps violently through daily life, reshaping land, law, and authority in ways that individuals cannot predict or prevent? By the end of 1066, England had been transformed. William of Normandy had secured the crown after the battles of Hastings and the south coast, while Harold Godwinson and Harold Hardrada lay dead on the fields of northern and southern England. For the kings and armies, history records decisive outcomes. Crowns changed hands, claims were asserted, and realms reorganized. But for ordinary Englishmen, life continued in its relentless, day-to-day rhythm, albeit under a profoundly altered political and social landscape. The immediate aftermath for villagers was a mixture of relief, fear, and uncertainty. The northern and southern campaigns had left fields trampled, livestock depleted, and storehouses empty. Villagers had survived famine, theft, and forced conscription. Those who had complied with either invading army might have endured abuse or loss, while those who resisted had paid a high price. The countryside bore visible scars of warfare. Burned villages, pillaged granaries, and makeshift fortifications where communities had tried to protect themselves. William's conquest introduced a new order. Norman lords replaced English landholders, often claiming estates by force or royal grant. The familiar local hierarchy was supplanted by a foreign elite. Villagers now reported to a lord whose language, customs, and legal practices were unfamiliar. Obligations changed. Rents, labor duties, and military service were redefined according to Norman practice. Even those who had previously enjoyed relative security under English earls now found their lives subject to new rules imposed from distant castles or the king's court. Yet daily survival did not stop. People continued to farm, tend livestock, repair homes, and prepare for winter. They adapted to the presence of new authorities while maintaining the routines necessary to live. Skills of observation, negotiation, and discretion became essential. Where compliance was necessary, villagers learned to comply without giving more than required. Where autonomy remained possible, they preserved traditions quietly. Local assemblies, seasonal festivals, and practices of farming or craft continued as before, even if they were now shadowed by Norman oversight. Religion played a stabilizing role. Churches remained centers of community life, providing both spiritual guidance and practical support. Priests mediated disputes, delivered news, and preserved literacy in an otherwise largely oral culture. The presence of new rulers did not diminish the role of faith. Instead, villagers relied on it to interpret the sudden shifts in power, to seek protection, and to sustain morale amid uncertainty. Social structures also adapted. Families reorganized work to cope with reduced manpower and resources. Community networks and formal alliances among neighbors intensified. Knowledge of local terrain, seasons, and resources became more valuable than ever. Villagers learned to anticipate the movements of Norman authorities and to protect resources through concealment, rationing, or labor. The practical intelligence of survival observation, timing, subtle negotiation became as crucial as obedience. The long-term consequences of Norman rule also reshaped identity and resilience. Over decades, English villagers absorbed new legal practices, landholding patterns, and social hierarchies while preserving elements of pre-conquest life. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, records the transformation. Land redistributed, wealth reallocated, populations catalogued. For ordinary people, it represents both imposition and continuity. Their existence is documented and regulated, but life, labor, and survival continue. Interestingly, this period reveals the quiet power of ordinary people to endure, even when kings and conquerors dictate terms. Villagers continued to farm, celebrate, trade, and raise families, demonstrating resilience that chroniclers rarely acknowledge. The rhythms of life, planting, harvesting, tending animals, mending tools, educating children, persisted. The mundane details of survival became acts of resistance against the totalizing force of conquest. By observing England from the perspective of ordinary people, it becomes clear that history is not solely determined by kings, generals, or battles. It is also shaped by how communities adapt, negotiate, and endure under changing circumstances. The conquest imposed new structures, but it could not erase human ingenuity, adaptability, or the slow, steady work of daily life. Villagers' responses, subtle, cautious, persistent, form a hidden history of continuity amid upheaval. The unresolved reflection remains. How much of a society's essence survives when leadership, law, and property are violently transformed? How do ordinary people, whose lives seem almost invisible to historians, preserve culture, community, and identity even as the world around them changes irrevocably? Story 6. Castles of Conquest, Norman Fortifications and Power. After the battles of 1066, William of Normandy's victory was far from secure. The English countryside was neither submissive nor uniformly loyal. Resistance simmered, rebellion was always possible, and the memory of former kings and their alliances lingered in villages and towns. William understood that conquest was not only a matter of defeating armies, it was about creating a landscape in which authority could be maintained, projected, and defended. For him, castles were more than military structures. They were instruments of governance, symbols of power, and tools of control over both land and people. The earliest Norman castles were not the massive stone fortresses that later generations imagined. They were primarily motte and bailey designs, a raised earthwork mound, the motte, topped with a wooden keep, adjacent to an enclosed courtyard, the bailey, surrounded by a timber palisade. These structures could be constructed quickly, sometimes in weeks, using local labor and materials. The speed of construction was crucial. The Normans could establish a presence, intimidate local populations, and defend their forces without waiting for stonework that might take years. William did not scatter castles randomly. Each one was strategically placed, at river crossings, along major roads, near towns, or on high ground overlooking fertile farmland. The locations were chosen for both military and administrative advantage. A castle at a crossroads allowed Norman forces to monitor movement, collect tolls, and respond quickly to uprisings. One on a hill dominated the surrounding territory visually and psychologically, reminding villagers that the new rulers were present, capable, and vigilant. Construction was labor-intensive and often imposed upon the local population. Villagers were required to provide food, labor, and materials. Timber was cut, earth dug, and ditches filled. Horses were used to transport heavy loads, while peasants shoveled, carried, and reinforced defenses. Though this labor might have been resented, it also represented a new social order. Obedience to Norman authority was tangible, immediate, and non-negotiable. The castles themselves were multifunctional. The motte served as a lookout, a defensive stronghold, and the residence of the lord or garrison commander. From its elevated position, signals could be sent to other castles using fire, smoke, or flags, primitive yet effective early warning systems. The bailey housed soldiers, stables, workshops, and storehouses. It could shelter the local population temporarily in times of danger, while also functioning as a center of administration and enforcement. Norman soldiers stationed in these castles were constantly active. Patrols ensured that roads remained secure and that no rebellion could grow unnoticed. They collected taxes, oversaw local courts, and maintained order. Their presence made abstract authority concrete. Norman law, previously theoretical, was now backed by the threat of force just over the hill. A single castle could dominate a wide radius of land, allowing a handful of soldiers to impose control over hundreds of villagers. The psychological impact was perhaps as important as the physical. For English peasants accustomed to earls who lived among them, often bound by mutual obligations and traditional laws, the arrival of a castle was disorienting. It represented foreign authority, permanence, and surveillance. A timber keep may have been simple, but its symbolism was profound. A new order had arrived, and it would not leave. Every glance toward the motte reminded villagers that rebellion carried real consequences. Castles also became centers of culture and exchange. Lords and their households brought Norman customs, language, and practices. Markets and fairs were often encouraged or controlled from castle precincts, creating nodes of economic as well as military influence. Over time, villages adapted. They learned to navigate the new system, provide goods and services, and negotiate obligations with the garrisoned elite. The speed and density of castle building after 1066 was remarkable. Chroniclers note that within a decade, hundreds of castles dotted England. Each one was a statement. William had one, and he intended to remain. But castles were not only defensive, they were proactive tools. They allowed the Normans to project power without needing to constantly patrol the countryside. Control could now be maintained with small forces, leaving the majority of the army free for campaigning, administration, or suppressing rebellion elsewhere. Even as these castles rose, challenges remained. Timber structures were vulnerable to fire, siege, or rot. Supply lines had to be maintained. Garrisoned soldiers were isolated from home, dependent on local resources and cooperation or coercion from the peasantry. Yet the overall strategy proved effective. Castles created a new geographic and social network that allowed the Normans to transform England into a territory they could administer from the ground up. By examining the castles of conquest, it becomes clear that the Norman takeover was not just a series of battles, but a systemic reshaping of society. The landscape itself was weaponized. Hills, rivers, and roads were incorporated into a network of control. Ordinary people, previously free to navigate local hierarchies and traditions, now had their behavior subtly constrained by the presence of these fortifications. The unresolved question remains. While castles allowed a handful of soldiers to dominate a wide territory, how did the presence of these permanent structures alter the relationships between rulers and the ruled over decades? Did they cultivate submission, resentment, adaptation, or all three? And what did that mean for the long-term integration of Norman rule? By the years following 1066, the Norman castles were no longer just symbols. They had become instruments of practical governance. Each motte and bailey structure served multiple roles: military stronghold, administrative hub, and economic regulator. For ordinary Englishmen living in their shadow, the presence of a castle reshaped almost every aspect of daily life, often in ways that were subtle, coercive, and relentless. The soldiers garrisoned in these castles were not idle. Their tasks were varied and constant. Patrols extended from the walls into surrounding villages, monitoring movement, guarding roads, and inspecting agricultural output. Normans required a steady supply of food, timber, and livestock resources that villagers were obligated to provide. Refusal could be interpreted as rebellion. Compliance was both protection and submission. The castle's walls thus became not just defensive structures, but centers of social control. Castles also facilitated law enforcement. Lords held courts within the bailey, adjudicating disputes over land, labor, or behavior. These proceedings were public but intimidating. The mere presence of armed soldiers reinforced authority. Decisions were enforced immediately, often with harsh consequences for disobedience. The combination of military oversight and legal authority ensured that power was concentrated in the hands of the few, yet visible to the many. Ordinary villagers internalized this system. They learned quickly where boundaries lay and how to navigate them. At the same time, castles were economic engines. Markets and fairs were often established nearby, controlled or regulated by the lord. Peasants and artisans were expected to participate, providing labor, food, and craft goods. While this brought opportunities for trade, it also tethered communities to the castle, making their economic survival dependent on maintaining favor and avoiding conflict with the garrison. The castle's influence extended far beyond its walls. It shaped commerce, labor, and the flow of goods in the surrounding countryside. Rebellion, though relatively rare, was a constant concern. The Norman presence did not guarantee peace. English lords, dispossessed landowners, and independent-minded peasants occasionally resisted. Castles allowed swift suppression. Small garrisons could mobilize quickly, striking at local insurgents or signaling reinforcements from other fortifications. Often, rebellion was punished through intimidation rather than combat. Burned homes, seized crops, and public executions. These measures reinforced the psychological dominance of the castle, a constant reminder that authority was backed by force. For soldiers, castle life was a mixture of vigilance, labor, and monotony. Daily routines included patrolling, maintaining defenses, drilling, and supervising local obligations. Training and discipline were crucial, as garrisons were typically small and needed to respond quickly to multiple threats. Soldiers lived within confined spaces, often cramped, with the mottes keep providing shelter but little comfort. Their existence was structured entirely around readiness and control, mirroring the broader strategy William had implemented across England. For villagers, the castles were a double-edged presence. On one hand, the proximity of a Norman garrison offered protection against raiders or rival lords. On the other hand, it imposed constraints, labor obligations, and constant surveillance. Ordinary people adapted, negotiating compliance with subtle strategies, hiding resources, timing deliveries, performing minimal required duties, and maintaining community cohesion without drawing punitive attention. The castle dictated not just obedience, but the rhythms of everyday life. Over time, castles evolved. Timber palisades were gradually replaced with stone keeps, towers, and curtain walls. These changes were more than architectural. They represented the normalization of Norman power. A stone castle was permanent, durable, and psychologically imposing. Where wooden structures might be temporary reminders of conquest, stone fortresses symbolized lasting domination. Villages adjusted accordingly, their inhabitants recalibrating behavior to suit the permanence of surveillance and authority. Yet castles did not erase English culture. Villagers continued traditional farming practices, celebrated seasonal festivals, and maintained oral histories of pre-conquest life. The Norman presence altered behavior and authority, but it could not erase generations of local knowledge, community networks, and social memory. In this sense, castles were instruments of adaptation as much as control. They forced ordinary people to develop resilience, ingenuity, and subtle strategies for continuity under new rulers. The unresolved tension lies in the interaction between permanence and adaptation. While castles allowed the Normans to consolidate power with relatively few troops, they also created a social experiment. How would local populations respond when authority was constant, visible, and backed by lethal force? Would obedience eventually give way to subtle resistance? Could daily life endure under the gaze of men whose entire purpose was to dominate and enforce? These questions linger quietly in the villages of England, shaping memory, behavior, and the slow evolution of society under Norman rule. By the mid-1070s, Norman castles had become an inseparable part of England's landscape. Timber moats had been replaced or supplemented with stone keeps and curtain walls. Some had grown into sprawling fortifications, complete with towers, gates, and fortified baileys, while others remained small but effective, symbols of Norman control. For William and his successors, these castles were not merely military assets, they were the foundation of governance, tools of taxation, and instruments for reshaping the social order. The strategic placement of castles created a web of authority that connected London, the southeast, the Midlands, and the north. Key towns, river crossings, and fertile regions were dominated by these fortresses. From their heights, Norman lords could survey farmland, roads, and villages, ensuring compliance and quickly suppressing unrest. Villagers, laborers, and smallholders understood that rebellion or defiance could be observed, reported, and punished with minimal delay. Power became geographically enforced. The construction of stone castles was both practical and symbolic. Stone required skill, labor, and time to quarry, transport, and assemble. Its permanence signaled that Norman rule was not temporary. It was designed to endure. The castles projected authority across generations, instilling both fear and adaptation among the English population. For villagers, daily life continued in proximity to these formidable structures. Their fields, roads, and cottages were within sight of towers, and their obligations to Norman lords were constant reminders of power. Castles also functioned as administrative centers. Lords used them to collect taxes, oversee the distribution of land, and adjudicate disputes. Courts convened in the bailey or keep allowed Norman authorities to impose laws that were new, foreign, and absolute. Legal proceedings, often brutal and immediate, reinforced the dominance of the conquerors while subtly reshaping local expectations of justice and authority. English customary law persisted informally, but the Normans codified their own system, creating dual layers of governance that villagers had to navigate carefully. Beyond law and military control, castles fostered economic transformation. Markets, fairs, and trade networks were often directed by the garrison or the lord's household. Peasants, artisans, and merchants adapted by participating in these markets, providing goods and labor under the watchful eye of Norman officials. The castles became centers of both commerce and control, linking economic activity to the mechanisms of domination. Villagers' survival increasingly depended on their ability to negotiate obligations without provoking punitive enforcement. Interestingly, Norman castles also stimulated cultural exchange, albeit asymmetrical. Soldiers and administrators brought Norman customs, language, and habits. Over time, English populations absorbed elements of these practices, words, farming techniques, and social norms into daily life. This slow cultural integration was not voluntary in the political sense. It was adaptation in the face of structural power. Villagers preserved continuity where possible. Seasonal festivals, local rituals, and oral histories maintained identity beneath layers of imposed authority. Yet the castles were not infallible. Rebellion persisted, though it was localized and sporadic. The harrying of the North, for example, demonstrates the dual role of castles and military campaigns. Fortresses allowed quick suppression, while harsh punitive measures ensured compliance in regions where resistance lingered. Castles facilitated both proactive governance and reactive control, embedding Norman authority into the physical and social landscape. Over decades, the castle's presence reshaped England's geography, society, and memory. Hills once dominated by forests or fields now bore keeps. Roads and rivers were monitored, towns reorganized, and local elites replaced or subordinated. Ordinary people learned to live with constant oversight, balancing adaptation with subtle preservation of local culture. Life became a negotiation between continuity and submission. Peasants tilled fields, observed obligations, and participated in markets, all while navigating a new social hierarchy imposed from stone towers. The legacy of these castles endured far beyond William's reign. They became permanent markers of conquest, symbols of authority, and centers from which later English monarchs would continue to project power. Architecturally, they set standards for fortification, influencing military design for centuries. Socially, they demonstrated the effectiveness of structural control. A small number of armed men, positioned strategically and backed by legal authority, could dominate vast territories. Politically, they allowed England to be governed efficiently even under foreign rulers, laying foundations for centralized monarchy. And yet, the castles also reveal the subtle tension between domination and adaptation. They could enforce power, but they could not erase memory, community, or resilience. English villages persisted, adapting labor, economy, and social life to coexist with these imposing structures. Over generations, villagers learned to survive and even thrive, integrating the presence of castles into the rhythms of life rather than allowing them to completely dictate it. The unresolved reflection remains. While castles embodied conquest and control, they also created a landscape where ordinary people could develop endurance, cunning, and continuity. In a sense, the towers and walls that symbolized domination also fostered resilience, shaping both rulers and the ruled in ways that would echo across centuries. How much of social identity, cultural practice, and daily life can persist under constant surveillance and foreign authority? And to what extent did the very presence of Norman castles ensure that ordinary English life adapted rather than disappeared? Story 7. The Doomsday Book, Recording a Conquered Kingdom. By 1085, nearly 2 decades after William of Normandy's conquest, England had been transformed. Castles dominated the landscape, new lords presided over villages, and Norman authority had become a tangible, enduring presence. Yet even the most meticulously built castles and disciplined garrisons could not fully guarantee knowledge of the kingdom's wealth, resources, and obligations. In an age where information traveled slowly and loyalties were fragile, the king faced a critical question. How could he accurately measure and control the land he now ruled? The answer was a survey unlike any that had been attempted before, the Domesday Book. Commissioned by William in 1085, this monumental record was a detailed catalogue of England's landholdings, population, livestock, resources, and obligations. Its purpose was straightforward but unprecedented: to assert royal control, ensure accurate taxation, and document ownership in a kingdom still recovering from conquest and rebellion. The process of creating the Domesday Book was laborious and bureaucratically complex. Royal commissioners, often accompanied by clerks, traveled across every county, village, and estate. They were armed with lists of questions. Who held the land before the conquest? Who holds it now? How many plows work the land? How many villagers, slaves, and smallholders reside there? What resources, mills, fisheries, woodland, pastures exist, and what is their value? The commissioner's task was not to interpret, but to record accurately. Every detail mattered. For the villagers and peasants, the arrival of the Domesday Survey was an extraordinary event. Imagine a smallholder in Somerset, suddenly approached by strangers in official garb, asking detailed questions about land, livestock, and labor. The peasant may not have understood the full purpose of these inquiries, but they sensed the weight of authority behind them. Mistakes, omissions, or attempts to hide resources could lead to severe consequences: fines, confiscation, or additional labor obligations. Cooperation was mandatory, though often uneasy. The survey also required local juries, usually composed of leading villagers, to provide information. These were the men who knew the land intimately, whose families had farmed it for generations. Their testimony was essential, but it was also constrained. They had to navigate loyalty to both new Norman lords and the king, balancing accuracy with self-preservation. Some may have minimized holdings to reduce taxes. Others may have emphasized resources to avoid suspicion or punishment. The resulting data, while comprehensive, reflected the subtle tensions between conquest and continuity. The Domesday Book recorded astonishing detail. It enumerated the number of plow teams in each manor, the extent of meadowland, the numbers of sheep, pigs, and oxen, even the presence of mills, fisheries, and woodlands sufficient to support pigs. It captured who worked the land: villagers, smallholders, and slaves, and how they were obligated to provide labor, produce, or service to their lord. By doing so, it created a snapshot of England that encompassed both the conquerors, administrative goals, and the lived reality of ordinary people. For William, the value of the Domesday Survey lay not just in knowledge, but in control through knowledge. Accurate records allowed the crown to collect taxes efficiently, allocate resources, and identify areas of potential resistance. Lords could be held accountable, and disputes over land could be resolved or adjudicated in favor of the crown. By recording the kingdom in exhaustive detail, William turned abstract authority into measurable, enforceable governance. The survey also preserved a record of pre-conquest England. By asking about landholdings before 1066, commissioners documented the transfer of property from Anglo-Saxon lords to Norman rulers. This created a historical record of dispossession, rebellion, and adaptation. The Domesday Book, in effect, captured both continuity and change. It showed how ordinary people had endured invasions, the loss of old elites, and the imposition of foreign authority, while continuing to work the land, pay obligations, and maintain villages. Yet despite its precision, the Domesday Book also raises questions. How accurate could such a survey be in a society where most people were illiterate, land tenure complex, and loyalties divided? How much of daily life, the rhythms of work, local customs, and informal economies was lost beneath the weight of administrative efficiency? For ordinary people, the survey was not just a record. It was an intrusion, a reminder that life was now measured, monitored, and ultimately accountable to a distant authority. And so, The Doomsday Book represents a remarkable convergence of conquest, administration, and ordinary life. It is a tool of control, a historical document, and a lens into the realities of 11th century England. Through its pages, we glimpse the material, social, and economic conditions of a land still recovering from invasion, while recognizing the enduring agency of villagers, smallholders, and laborers who continued to navigate daily life under new rulers. The unresolved thought remains: how did the act of recording, cataloging, and measuring a kingdom affect the relationship between rulers and the ruled? Could a king truly understand his kingdom through numbers and surveys, or did the lived experience of ordinary people always exceed the reach of even the most detailed accounting? After the Doomsday Survey began in 1085, the Norman administration faced a daunting challenge: compiling, verifying, and organizing an immense amount of information across a kingdom that had only recently been conquered. The process required not only meticulous record-keeping, but also careful management of the tension between accuracy and authority. For ordinary English villagers, the consequences of this survey were immediate, practical, and deeply felt, even if they could not read a single line of the final book. Royal commissioners, often drawn from trusted clerks, knights, and local officials, traveled county by county, manor by manor. They summoned juries, groups of men who knew the land intimately, to provide testimony about holdings, resources, and obligations. These juries were a curious mix of continuity and change. They preserved local knowledge while operating under the scrutiny of foreign authority. Their testimony recorded plow teams, meadows, pastures, woodland, livestock, mills, fisheries, and even the number of households. Every detail mattered because the king's income and the ability of Norman lords to govern depended upon it. For the villagers, participation in the survey was not optional. A single misstatement could result in fines, confiscation of property, or increased labor obligations. Many villagers had to recount not only what they had, but also what they owed to their new Norman lords, while simultaneously acknowledging the pre-conquest holdings of their former Anglo-Saxon overlords. The delicate negotiation of truth and survival was constant. Those who attempted to conceal wealth risked exposure, while those who over-reported could face higher taxation. Accuracy became a survival skill, balancing prudence with honesty in a world of new rulers. The consequences of the Doomsday Survey were both immediate and long-lasting. Firstly, it enabled the crown to collect taxes more efficiently. Previously, royal revenue depended on inconsistent local records, oral pledges, and the variable cooperation of lords. With the survey, William had a detailed map of assets across the kingdom: who owed what, who controlled which lands, and what resources were available to fund military campaigns, castles, and administration. The crown could demand dues with unprecedented authority, backed by both records and military enforcement. Secondly, the survey allowed William to consolidate his power over Norman and English lords alike. Land disputes could be settled in favor of the crown, ensuring that loyalty and submission were measurable and enforceable. Lords who had gained estates through conquest could be audited, checked against prior holdings, and held accountable for obligations. In this way, the Doomsday Book was not merely a financial tool, it was a political instrument, legitimizing authority while reinforcing submission. For ordinary people, these developments translated into concrete changes in daily life. Villagers, obligations became more standardized and predictable, but also more binding. Labor services for lords, the allocation of crops, and payment of taxes were now documented, leaving less room for negotiation or discretion. At the same time, the survey inadvertently preserved a record of the pre-conquest economy, capturing the lives, labor, and resources of English communities as they existed before Norman domination. It is through this lens that modern historians can reconstruct ordinary life in 11th century England, including the work of smallholders, tenants, and slaves people who are otherwise invisible in military chronicles and royal charters. Interestingly, the Doomsday Survey also facilitated subtle adaptation. Villagers and smallholders learned to navigate the new order by understanding the mechanics of record keeping. They recognized that compliance, precision, and cooperation could mitigate harsh punishment. Communities developed strategies for reporting obligations and resources in ways that balanced survival with minimal exposure to exploitation. The survey, while an instrument of control, also revealed the agency of ordinary people in a highly constrained environment. The scope of the Doomsday Book was staggering. The survey recorded tens of thousands of holdings across hundreds of shires, cataloging property, livestock, and social obligations. Its detailed enumeration of men, women, and slaves alongside the physical resources of the land represents one of the most comprehensive administrative projects of the medieval world. For historians, it remains an unparalleled window into the economic, social, and legal landscape of post-conquest England. Yet the Doomsday Book also raises unresolved questions about the relationship between rulers and the ruled. Even with detailed records, the lived experience of ordinary people's daily labor, seasonal rhythms, local customs, and the informal economy cannot be fully captured by surveys. How much did William truly understand about the conditions of his subjects, beyond numbers and valuations? How did ordinary villagers perceive this intrusive accounting of their lives, and how did it shape their strategies for adaptation, compliance, or quiet resistance? The survey's consequences endured for generations. By creating a detailed, centralized record, William laid the foundation for systematic governance, taxation, and property rights that persisted well beyond his reign. At the same time, it highlighted the limitations of knowledge. While the crown could enumerate assets, it could not fully measure human ingenuity, resilience, or the subtle ways communities preserved identity and autonomy under foreign rule. The unresolved tension is clear. The Doomsday Book documented conquest and control with remarkable precision, yet it also exposed the persistent gap between the ruler's perception and the lived reality of the ruled. How much of England's social fabric, economy, and local culture could be measured or even controlled through paper, ink, and the testimonies of juries? And how did ordinary people continue to shape their own lives, even under the scrutiny of the most comprehensive medieval survey ever undertaken? By the time the Doomsday Book was completed in 1086, it had transformed England's relationship with its rulers. For William of Normandy, it was a triumph of administration, a single, meticulously compiled record that allowed him to measure, monitor, and manage his kingdom with unprecedented authority. For the English people, however, it was both a symbol and an instrument of foreign oversight, simultaneously enabling order and reminding them of the precariousness of their positions. The Doomsday Book did more than record numbers. It institutionalized governance. Prior to its compilation, English rulers had relied on local knowledge, oral pledges, and inconsistent records to manage taxation, justice, and military obligations. With Doomsday, William possessed a central repository of information that could be referenced to enforce claims, settle disputes, and organize resources. Lords' obligations were documented, peasants' duties codified, and taxable value determined systematically. The king's authority became measurable in ink as much as in force. For ordinary villagers, the survey's effects were profound. Although daily life tilling fields, tending animals, repairing homes continued, it was now intertwined with recorded obligations that extended beyond the immediate oversight of local lords. Farmers and smallholders learned to navigate these rules with care. They measured labor, crop yields, and livestock against what had been reported, ensuring they met their duties without overextending themselves. Adaptation became a survival strategy. Compliance with recorded expectations, combined with subtle negotiation and local ingenuity, allowed communities to persist under new authority. The Doomsday Book also reshaped memory and identity. By documenting pre-conquest holdings alongside post-conquest changes, it preserved the historical record of dispossession, continuity, and adaptation. English villagers could see their world transformed in writing, lands reallocated to Norman lords, new obligations imposed, and familiar neighbors replaced or subordinated. Even if most could not read the text, the consequences were palpable. Oral knowledge circulated alongside formal records, shaping perceptions of justice, continuity, and the permanence of Norman authority. Interestingly, the survey also encouraged adaptation in governance at the local level. Manor courts relied on the Domesday records to enforce obligations and manage disputes. English and Norman lords alike could reference documented entitlements, labor services, and property ownership to justify their decisions. Ordinary people, in turn, became adept at interpreting and negotiating these frameworks, maintaining both compliance and subtle forms of autonomy. Economically, Domesday facilitated a more predictable extraction of resources. Taxation and labor obligations could now be assessed accurately, allowing Norman rulers to plan campaigns, fund castles, and maintain garrisons without constant uncertainty. This level of control reinforced authority across the kingdom, but it also subtly reshaped English social structures. Wealth, productivity, and labor were quantified, standardized, and directly tied to obligations under Norman rule. Yet, despite its precision, the Domesday Book could not fully capture the lived experience of English communities. Seasonal labor, social networks, customary practices, and informal economies existed beyond the reach of ink and parchment. Villagers preserved traditions, stories, and local knowledge that survived the imposition of foreign authority. In a sense, the survey codified control, but it also highlighted the limitations of administrative oversight. Human ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation remained intangible, though no less real. The legacy of the Domesday Book is enduring. It is a tool of governance, a historical document, and a window into the social, economic, and cultural conditions of late 11th century England. Its meticulous records allowed Norman rulers to consolidate power effectively, but it also preserved a snapshot of ordinary life under extraordinary circumstances. Generations later, historians rely on Domesday to understand both the conquest and the continuity of everyday existence. The unresolved thought lingers. How do rulers measure what they can never fully control? William quantified land, wealth, and labor, yet he could not enumerate the strategies of adaptation, the quiet resilience, or the social networks that sustained English communities. In a kingdom reshaped by conquest, it was these subtle, human factors, the work of ordinary villagers, smallholders, and laborers, that ensured survival and continuity, even when the world was recorded, taxed, and monitored in unprecedented detail. Story 8. The Harrying of the North, Rebellion and Retaliation. In the years following William of Normandy's conquest, England was not yet entirely at peace. The South, dominated by Norman castles and loyal lords, experienced relative stability, but the North remained a region of simmering discontent. The memory of English kings, the traditions of Anglo-Saxon nobility, and the cultural differences between conquerors and conquered created fertile ground for resistance. By 1069, this unrest would erupt into one of the most devastating episodes in English medieval history, the Harrying of the North. To understand the rebellion, we must first consider the region itself. Northern England, Yorkshire, Northumbria, and the surrounding shires was geographically and socially distinct from the south. The land was more rugged, sparsely populated, and culturally tied to both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions. The earldom of Northumbria, long a semi-autonomous region, had its own leaders, local councils, and military traditions. Villagers, farmers, and townspeople were accustomed to certain freedoms under their earls, including rights over land, local governance, and defense against raiders. After the conquest, Norman authority extended tentatively into the north. Castles and garrisons were fewer, and the region's ruggedness allowed local populations to resist taxation and oversight. Norman lords, unfamiliar with local customs and distant from William's court, struggled to maintain control. This distance created opportunities for rebellion, and by 1069, discontent coalesced into action. Rebellion began in multiple locations almost simultaneously. Northumbrian leaders who had survived the initial conquest allied with disaffected peasants, slaves, and smallholders. Their grievances were both political and economic. They resented foreign lords, increased taxes, forced labor, and the erosion of local rights. Their resistance was strategic, often coordinated and effective in disrupting Norman authority. Castles were attacked, supply lines raided, and Norman officials targeted. In some cases, local populations supported insurgents covertly, hiding food, providing shelter, and facilitating communication. The rebels were aided in part by external actors. King Sweyn II of Denmark, concerned with Scandinavian interests in England, encouraged raids and provided limited military support. This external pressure magnified the threat, as Norman forces faced rebellion not only from local populations, but also from foreign intervention. William recognized that, unchecked, these uprisings could destabilize his entire northern policy and encourage further resistance elsewhere. For ordinary villagers, the rebellion brought both hope and danger. Some saw an opportunity to restore autonomy, reclaim lands, or support familiar leaders. Others feared the consequences if the revolt failed. Families had to navigate allegiances carefully. Providing supplies to rebels risked retribution, while refusing to cooperate could invite suspicion or punishment. The landscape itself, villages, fields, and roads, became part of the strategic calculation. Survival depended on observation, timing, and often sheer luck. William's response was decisive. Rather than relying solely on punitive raids or military engagements, he orchestrated a comprehensive campaign designed to eliminate the capacity for rebellion entirely. This would involve both direct confrontation and systematic destruction of the means of subsistence. It was a strategy that recognized a harsh reality. In regions like the North, rebellion was not only political, it was sustained by the resilience and self-sufficiency of ordinary people. The early stages of the harrying of the North, therefore, reflect a tense interplay between rebellion and authority. The North was a land of resistance, culturally distinct and geographically advantageous to those who opposed Norman rule. Villagers, smallholders, and even townspeople became active participants in this struggle, whether through direct action or subtle forms of support. The rebellion was rooted in a desire to maintain autonomy, preserve livelihoods, and resist an imposed system that threatened both material survival and cultural identity. The unresolved question lingers: how far can a ruling power go to suppress rebellion without destroying the very population it seeks to govern? In the North, William's next actions would answer that question with brutal clarity, but at what cost to ordinary life, social continuity, and the memory of the region? By late 1069, William of Normandy had recognized that the northern rebellions could not be contained through negotiation alone. Castles and garrisons were insufficient to enforce loyalty over a region as vast and resistant as Northumbria. The local population's resilience, its ability to hide supplies, defend villages, and support insurgents posed a persistent threat. William's solution was brutal and systematic. The harrying of the North, a campaign designed not merely to defeat armies, but to destroy the capacity of the population to resist. The campaign unfolded during the harsh winter months of 1069–1070, exploiting both the vulnerability of the population and the strategic advantage of timing. Norman forces advanced through northern England, moving from village to village, town to town. Unlike a typical military engagement, the operation targeted civilians as much as combatants. Villages were burned, granaries destroyed, and livestock slaughtered. Crops in the fields were cut down or trampled, leaving nothing for the following spring. Even the landscape itself became a tool of control. Rivers and forests were left desolate, ditches filled, and homes reduced to ash. The impact on ordinary people was catastrophic. Families fled, often with nothing but the clothes on their backs, only to face exposure, starvation, and disease. Those who remained were trapped, with no shelter, no food stores, and little hope of survival. Chroniclers describe entire regions depopulated, with accounts of thousands perishing. While these numbers are difficult to quantify precisely, the evidence of famine, deserted villages, and abandoned farmland paints a picture of unprecedented social disruption. The harrying was not a battle. It was a deliberate strategy to eliminate the resources and will of a population capable of sustaining rebellion. Yet the resilience of ordinary people is evident even in this devastation. Some survivors managed to hide food or seek refuge in forests and remote settlements. Local knowledge of the terrain, rivers, and hills provided limited shelter from Norman patrols. Families that remained often relied on communal networks, sharing whatever meager resources they could salvage. Survival became a day-to-day negotiation with death, hunger, and exposure. Human endurance persisted, even in the shadow of total devastation. The campaign's strategic logic was clear to William. Rebellion could not be tolerated, and deterrence required an example. By making the consequences of defiance visible, he sought to prevent future uprisings in both the north and other regions of England. Castles, which had been effective in controlling populations in the south, were supplemented by a scorched earth policy that ensured resistance could not easily regain momentum. The harrying created a landscape in which compliance was not merely advisable, it was a matter of life and death. Economically, the northern counties were shattered. Farmland remained fallow for years, livestock populations declined sharply, and trade routes were disrupted. Norman lords faced a depopulated territory that could not immediately yield taxes or resources. For ordinary people, the consequences were intergenerational. Surviving families contended with the loss of homes, land, and community structures, while the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and trade had to be reestablished from scratch. Social continuity was deeply fractured, even as Norman authority became entrenched. Religious institutions were not spared. Churches and monasteries were burned or looted, further destabilizing local communities. Priests, monks, and nuns fled or were killed, removing spiritual guidance and support structures for survivors. The destruction of sacred sites compounded the social trauma, disrupting both faith and the informal systems of governance and charity that had supported ordinary people. Yet, over time, rebuilding occurred, often under the supervision or patronage of Norman lords, embedding the conquerors more firmly into the social and spiritual life of the region. The harrying also exposed the limits of authority through terror. While the campaign effectively suppressed organized rebellion in the north for decades, it could not entirely erase cultural memory. Survivors passed down accounts of famine, violence, and resilience. Villagers reconstructed communities, rebuilt homes, and cultivated new fields, but the trauma lingered. Social networks were reconfigured. Oral histories preserved the memory of suffering, and the northern counties developed a cautious approach to external authority that lasted for generations. The unresolved tension is stark. William's strategy achieved immediate military and political objectives, yet it came at immense human cost. Ordinary people endured, adapted, and survived, but the landscape of everyday life, farms, homes, villages, social ties was irrevocably altered. How do societies recover from campaigns designed to destroy their very capacity to live and resist? And what forms of memory, resilience, or subtle defiance persist long after the flames have subsided? By the end of the winter of 1070, the northern counties of England were unrecognizable. Villages lay in ashes, fields remained fallow, and livestock populations had been decimated. The harrying of the north had achieved William's immediate goal. Rebellion was crushed, and the memory of defiance would be overshadowed by fear. Yet the human consequences were profound, and the long-term effects on ordinary Englishmen, communities, and the landscape were complex and enduring. The devastation was both physical and social. Families who survived the flames had to reconstruct homes from whatever materials they could salvage, often starting with simple shelters made of wood and thatch. Fields had to be cleared of debris and replanted, sometimes for several seasons before yielding sufficient harvests. Villagers faced ongoing food shortages. Famine persisted, forcing people to rely on wild plants, stored grain if any survived, and the meager assistance of local lords or monasteries. Survival required ingenuity, adaptability, and communal effort. Families banded together, pooling labor and resources, while local networks of support became crucial for basic subsistence. The Norman lords and administrators, who had orchestrated the destruction, were forced to confront the practical consequences. A depopulated landscape could not generate immediate rents or taxes, nor could it provide labor for reconstruction or military obligations. Castles and garrisons remained, but the economy was effectively frozen in much of Northumbria. Lords encouraged migration, settlement, and repopulation, offering incentives such as reduced obligations or temporary land grants to attract farmers back to the devastated lands. Yet even with such efforts, the northern counties took decades to recover demographically and economically. For ordinary people, the harrying created both trauma and adaptation. Survivors carried vivid memories of fire, famine, and violence, which were passed orally through families and communities. These stories informed social behavior. Villages became cautious, wary of both external authority and internal betrayal. The experience shaped labor practices, agricultural organization, and even settlement patterns, with many communities relocating to safer or more defensible locations. The harrying demonstrated that survival required vigilance, prudence, and flexibility, qualities that became embedded in northern social culture. Religious institutions played a crucial role in recovery. Churches and monasteries, though destroyed or looted, became focal points for rebuilding both material and social life. Priests, monks, and nuns assisted in resettling communities, organizing relief, and providing spiritual guidance to people who had witnessed extreme suffering. The restoration of sacred spaces reinforced a sense of continuity and hope, reminding survivors that even after destruction, community and ritual could endure. Economically, recovery was slow but persistent. Fields gradually returned to cultivation, livestock herds were rebuilt, and trade resumed along key routes, often regulated by nearby castles or Norman administrators. Villagers had to negotiate new relationships with lords and garrisons, balancing compliance with local traditions and survival strategies. The imposition of Norman authority was absolute in some respects, but in everyday life, ordinary people retained agency. They farmed, traded, and rebuilt communities under the watchful eyes of conquerors, demonstrating resilience amid control. The harrying of the North also shaped historical memory. Chroniclers and local oral histories emphasized the devastation, framing it as a moral and political lesson. Rebellion carried severe consequences. Yet within these narratives lies another story: the quiet persistence of ordinary people. Despite destruction, famine, and social upheaval, communities survived, adapted, and ultimately rebuilt. The North's recovery is a testament to human resilience. The ability to endure trauma, reconstruct social and economic systems, and continue life even when every familiar structure has been destroyed. The unresolved reflection endures. How does a society reconcile the necessity of survival with the memory of deliberate destruction? In northern England, the harrying created both fear and adaptation, trauma and resilience. Ordinary people had to navigate a world in which power could annihilate their villages, yet life persisted. How much of the cultural, social, and economic identity of the North was permanently altered, and how much endured, hidden in the rhythms of daily labor, communal solidarity, and local memory. The harrying of the North illustrates the paradox of conquest. Authority can crush rebellion through terror, but it cannot entirely extinguish human endurance. Villages, families, and communities survive, often quietly, reshaping their lives to endure, adapt, and ultimately preserve continuity, even in the shadow of devastation.